the viewers have missed that glorious little jive there.
Well, I mean, the best material of ours is always when we're off air. I mean, the
yeah.
audience just simply has to be aware of that.
Indeed, basically the I'm always gutted when we finish, because you always have at least one extra anecdote that gets missed, that comes in when there. Good evening, everybody. Sorry for the late start. Couldn't be avoided for a couple of reasons on both of our ends, but we are here now for another Fake Accents Unite. How are you, Britisher?
Well, feeling particularly fake today. And of course, feeling somewhat chipper because I yesterday passed the 20,000 mark. And yes, therefore I'm feeling a sort of an inch or two taller today.
Oh, marvelous! For those who don't know, Will says, "I demand more fake accents." Well, when we find some, I'm sure we will.
Well, yes, I would still always tell everybody, tweet the squire, tell him to get his backside into gear, and to get on here with us, But I have contacted the man once or twice, well, more than once or twice, and have got nowhere. But he has most certainly one of the jolliest fake accents that you could possibly ask for. And
Indeed.
Time and time again, people suggest to me that I should work together with him. And yet, as long as he doesn't reply to a tweet, there is not much I can do.
Indeed, there's yes, you can't force someone to respond. Joan Everton says, "I believe I have found the most English/British song ever. It's called Oak, Ash and Thorn by Peter Bellamy." Do you know it?
I cannot say that I'm familiar with that, no.
I can't say that I am. I am at the moment trying to talk to V about how to get audio to stream properly on a live stream, because I noticed that he had one earlier which he managed successfully.
I think it is all in the software
to get it to run.
So yes. I believe you may be able to coax OBS if you know how to use it, to use audio. I tried to use OBS once, and it sent me live without my knowing that I was live.
Interesting.
And it then lodged the video in such a way that I found it impossible, without instruction from an expert from YouTube, to actually dislodge the video from my channel again.
Yes.
So some people will know that there was a bit of a running joke for some time of there being a live stream video of mine of about 35 seconds length on my channel that simply couldn't be removed.
Little do you realize that 35 seconds was responsible for 75% of your viewer base, because people couldn't believe it.
Now that you come to mention it, yes.
Good evening. A couple of things that we want to discuss at some length this evening. Let's see. We have, first of all, the Article 13. Right now, anyone who doesn't know what Article 13 is, hopefully this stream will elucidate to you. But this is a new proposal by the EU that is going to go live. I believe they're going to vote on it on, let me see here. Yes, on the 20th to the 21st of June.
Yeah.
Yes. Members of the European Parliament are the only ones that can stand in the way of bad copyright legislation. So,
because it came from the European Commission, so basically they are the ones who proposed these laws.
Mm-hmm.
It has already been passed by the European Council. That is effectively when I think it's the heads of government of countries get together.
Yes.
Either that, or it could be also ministers, I'm not sure. But basically, they've already passed it. So your government has already said yes to this.
Yes.
And now the only thing that could really stop it would be the European Parliament. The problem with that is that the European Parliament is made up largely of Europhiles. So this is made up largely of people who are terribly enthusiastic about the European Union, even in Eurosceptic countries. Because, I mean, just ask yourself, what kind of people does it attract to stand for, those sort of offices? So even though, yes, there are people like Nigel Farage and whatever at the European Parliament, by and large, it is, to the overwhelming majority, made up of people who just think the European Union is fantastic.
Indeed.
So how likely is it really that this is going to get rejected?
Very unlikely.
Yeah, indeed.
Now you'll notice that I am now sharing my screen because I'm aware that people will not be aware necessarily about what on earth this legislation, how damaging it is, basically. Oh, excuse me.
Oh, have we lost?
We have not, but I did just sneeze off microphone. Getting
well done, well done.
Excuse me, I have terrible hay fever this evening, so if I go quiet for periods of about 2 or 3 seconds, I'm probably blowing my nose. But yes, as you can see on screen,
I think he's blowing his nose again, ladies and gentlemen.
Oh, thank you for that, Brisha. Article 13 is a provision in the proposed EU copyright directive, and it mandates that all content uploaded to the internet be monitored. It's very a la, sort of Chinese, Great Firewall of China. But basically, anything uploaded to the internet is monitored and potentially deleted if it already exists and is copyrighted. And this is going to be voted on properly by the end of this year. And now everyone is affected by this because it has a number of key pieces of legislation in it. Sorry to hear that, Will. That's fine. 5 minutes to go. But basically, this legislation means that you will have to be an approved journalist in order to report on things which already have a copyright on it. And if you are, like so many of the YouTubers here and around are commentating on the state of affairs, and they reference and cite different points of articles, you will now need basically a license to cite sources, to cite a piece of copyrighted material, including journalistic articles. So if a journalist comes out and says something egregious, you can't comment on it until you get a license from the publisher of that article to actually comment on it. Which obviously, if you're someone like, say, myself, Britisher, Sargon of Akkad, anything in that realm, is unlikely to happen.
It's unlikely. It could be a very it could be a very sort of streamlined process and whatever. It might just be something, where you tick boxes on their site or something like that, and thereby have to pay some micropayments. But it could already render it, financially impossible. But what is all the more interesting is, what if what if it isn't someone like me, whom they've, let's face it, whom they've never heard from, before. What if it is someone like Breitbart or Alex Jones Infowars or Paul Joseph Watson, people they treat as the enemy? If someone like Paul Joseph Watson wants to quote a Guardian article, what chance does he have? So even if he's willing to pay the license and all that, he would still need permission. So if you need permission, then surely that permission can be denied.
Indeed. There's also trouble with the fact that there will be special copyright dispensation to try and preserve freedom of the press given to registered journalists. Now, that means you have to be a registered journalist. You have to be approved by the Euro. Now,
in that case, what I suggest is that we all get together and we create some kind of ludicrous office, which is basically just a mailbox somewhere.
Yeah.
And we give it some grand name as the Great British Journalism Foundation or something like that. And we basically issue ourselves some kind of accreditation. And yes, then we go from there.
Unfortunately, it looks like it has to be European certification, which again, in and of itself, is even worse because Europe is committed to preserving itself.
I can just see the form you have to fill in. Eurocert 1. Yes.
Oh God. But you can imagine as well that the bloody if Europe degrades, shall we say, if the EU's position starts degrading, let's say Italy secedes, that sort of thing, as well as we're obviously trying to go through Brexit and all of that, then the idea that a news organization that has an active Eurosceptic tone to it may be denied, I think exponentially increases. I just think
well, I mean, when it comes to manipulation of the press, isn't there a substantial danger that this law in itself represents a manipulation of the press? Because
yes,
if this doesn't create a press that is beholden to them for receiving massive financial, because what they're really trying to do is that when it comes to the financial side, they're not really trying to get at blokes like us. What they're trying to do is get at the Googles and the Facebooks. They see them as the big piggy banks. So if they can squeeze several tens of millions out of them and transfer that to the press, well, then everybody's happy all round.
yes,
because it's called Google and Facebook. I mean, they're making that much money, they won't miss it. That's how the European Union looks at it.
Yes.
If it then has the added benefit of driving the likes of us off the net, well, then all the better.
Yes. So here again on the screen share, you can see the generic things it threatens and why. The one that's just popped off screen said threatens discussion forums, which is very true, because if you can't, here we are. Threatens blogging platforms, threatens gamers that live stream. Yeah, that's another thing as well. Like Twitch, for instance, is a massive platform that streams nothing but effectively copyrighted content. It'll be very interesting to see what happens with that. Discussion platforms, goodbye Reddit and that sort of thing, apart from about sort of stuff that's even more banal than gets discussed on there already. Memes, because obviously memes typically come out of something silly that has happened at the moment, so you won't be able to do that. The sharing of parodies and all sorts of particularly nasty things. Music threatens developers who, people who write, who do covers or who do remixes of popular music, and threatens things like code sharing, which means open source doesn't really exist anymore if you do that incorrectly. Not a great state of affairs, really.
No, and as I say, this will affect people. This will hit people themselves more so than perhaps they realize. Just simple communications on social media. You sending someone else a link to an article that you either find funny or in any way of interest. That link itself would effectively be copyrighted. One struggles to kind of believe that they came up with this and thought this was a good idea.
Yes, it's going to hit small businesses and startups the hardest, because the majority of them are still finding their feet. So they are likely to make little mistakes along the way. And if those little mistakes end up being a large number of fines or a ban on their content or whatever, then that's very damaging to doing it. They are effectively hamstringing any new news organization, because they will have to seek certification before they can even do the stories they want to do. And I mean, how far does this extend, do you think, when it comes to whichever news organization covers something first? Can they claim copyright if another news organization puts another quote?
Anybody who has original content from whatever story, so it isn't necessarily the first person to report from Singapore on the Kim Jong-un Donald Trump meeting. Basically, anybody who sends any material from that, you wouldn't be able to link to, you wouldn't be able to do anything with unless you had permission, and most likely you would be paying. So
yes,
it's what you're looking for. What you're looking at here is more than likely something that would be akin to I mean, I'm just trying to use my imagination here. Something akin to the BBC license fee, whereby they would effectively have a solid amount of money just pouring in every year from these various sources.
Yes.
So, of course, as far as they're concerned, this is wonderful.
Yeah, win-win for them.
You also will have noticed that there is a certain dearth of reporting on this particular subject. So somehow they're not too keen in telling the world that this is going on.
Yes. It seems to be very constrained. I'm surprised that people haven't noticed it more.
Well, I mean, if you're not told about it, I mean, the first thing I heard about it was from a Dave Cullen video, because he tends to be fairly clued up on these things, and even he was basically saying, at the time, there's only about 3 to 4 weeks to go. I don't know how they always manage to keep these things out of sight until the last moment. So since then, there's perhaps been another week or so that has passed, and here we are. And you just sort of find it bizarre how, we hear about Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump, long before they get together or anything like that.
Yes.
Mostly when you hear about policies being discussed or something like that that are of interest to the people, you hear about it long in advance. So people are effectively able to follow its progress. When it comes to this just appeared. And it appeared with us being told that it's almost already passed.
Yes. If you can see now on the Hangouts link that it says that they will be using censorship machines. So effectively, an automated censorship machine, a link tax for news content, which you're referencing, and a very narrow exception for text and data mining, which is obviously data mining is a technique that is used by a number of scientific sort of organizations to generate statistics and that sort of thing. But under this legislation, you would have to be an approved scientific body by the EU in order to data mine.
Yeah, and I would do a bet that they would be willing, knowing how these things work and knowing how they work here in Britain too. I could well imagine that they would be willing to make exceptions where it suits them. So,
indeed,
to give you an idea, here in Britain, they are talking of creating a law whereby the deplatforming at universities is supposed to be stopped. And of course, your immediate reaction is, "Oh, huzzah! Finally, this deplatforming nonsense at university will be stopped." Until you read the fine print, and then you basically find out that, well, the government of course concurs that far right speakers shouldn't be allowed to speak.
Oh, for goodness sake!
We all know what that means. I mean, if Sargon of Akkad is far right, and that's why he's just been stopped at Scarborough, then
classical liberal Sargon of Akkad was that?
Yes.
The most centrist man I've ever met.
So you've got that now. Transfer that sort of attitude to this particular law, and then tell me whether any outlets. I mean, tell me whether InfoWars will get any payment from the Guardian.
Well, I wonder how
the Guardian makes a report on, how silly Alex Jones is and how terribly right-wing this body is and whatever. I would be willing to bet money that they wouldn't get any money for that, because there would be some sort of exception whereby there would be a public interest defense for reporting on the far right or some such thing.
Oh, yes.
Now, of course, I'm completely speculating here, but I think you can see where I'm coming from.
Yes, the issue isn't necessarily, well, the issue is with the legislation, but it's also with the huge, again, with the vagary of it, which, again, like the term far right, for instance. And you just go, well, how do you, unless someone self-identifies themselves as far right, how are you identifying people as far right? Right? It's as simple as that, because you go, is it a specific belief that they claim to hold?
Or do you even yourself have to identify as far right to be accepted as far right. Because
Exactly.
people like Lawrence Southern and Tommy Robinson say that they're not far right, yet they're called far right.
Indeed.
So basically, if you yourself don't identify as something, and we know how keen they are on people who identify as something, then, you know, in what way can they then officially be deemed that?
Exactly. And is it just by the approved journalists of the EU, or the
Oh yes, yes,
AJOE?
there'll no doubt there'll be some kind of register, you know, Eurojourn. They will be the registry of approved journalists. Yes.
Yes. To what extent can someone declare you to be something that you claim not to be?
But you also have to understand that you are looking at something whereby we know that the old media effectively viscerally hates the new media.
Yes,
I mean,
100%.
we've seen these attacks on PewDiePie and whatever. You know, we know how there was this concerted effort to attack the advertising on Google's advertising system, which led to the
adpocalypse.
The adpocalypse, yes. So we know there is this issue going on. Now, if this doesn't effectively, you know, if this doesn't hand sort of the upper hand to the old media over the new media in order to effectively turn off the tap, because effectively nobody on new media will be allowed to go near any information.
No, it's very concerning.
Is there, you know, so the only model that, you know, I've been thinking about this, the only model that effectively will be feasible, if you look at anybody talking and discussing news, would be that of Stux Hexenhammer or of Lionel from Lionel Media. Because those are people who don't give you any links, they don't give you any headlines, they just sit there and talk to camera and tell you that this particular issue that is in the news today, that you can go and look up. You know, you can watch on the news to inform yourself, so to speak.
Oh, everything's going to become really vague.
But nobody will be able to provide you with a link to anywhere. No one will be able to show you, to demonstrate to you that they've done some research on this issue.
I assume search engines will be exempt from these link taxes.
No, I mean, this is just it. Because, of course, when it comes to Google News and things like that, you know, where they aggregate news, that has been pointed out. That is one of the areas that has been pointed out, that not only do they show you the title of a news story, which is then, of course, the title that has been written by, say, the BBC or the Guardian or the Daily Mail or whoever. Not only do they show you the title, very often you actually get a picture that is taken from the article.
Oh, yes.
Automatically picked up by the, you know, so they're effectively saying that you get a bit of the blurb, you get the title, and you get the picture. So even though it links to their article, they are saying that just, you know, the audience being able to see this summarized piece of news already is Google stealing it from, you know, from the, you know, the journalism outlets.
Well, it's worse than you think, because how Google is so fast is it has data, it has crawlers that go through the internet that collect archived copies of all the websites that it's going to show you. So it has a database of these things, and every so often they send out a new one, and it updates the existing archived copy. And basically, so what's happening is they have these massive databases with all these links and the little synopses that you just mentioned. And so will them storing that then be illegal as well? The Philip Mason brings up a good point in chat. He says, how can they apply this outside the jurisdiction of the EU, particularly including places like America?
Well, this is one of the problems when it comes to anything published. And that is every country in the world, and I'm not making this up, every country in the world basically claims to be in charge of all global publishing. Because all of them have a hard and fast rule whereby if it is downloadable, if it is viewable from their country, then it is published in their country.
Oh.
So, like that, we've had fantastic court cases in London between a Ukrainian billionaire oligarch taking a Ukrainian newspaper to court for an article written in Ukrainian.
Mm.
Because he obviously realized he would stand a better chance in a British court and would be able to do this publication a great bit more damage suing them in a British court. But given that nothing of it is in English, you just wonder what on earth has this got to do with us?
Yes.
But because every country has this ludicrous attitude, that is one of the reasons why effectively this sort of legislation would impact also on the Americans.
Yes. I can see it all being a bit of a cluster, to be honest. To put it bluntly, it's just they'll just use, Dominic says they'll just use one of these global summits, like a G summit, to get major countries to sign up to it. And then it will be this sort of covered area, but obviously each country will be free to appoint journalists that it wants to. But it's just, I mean, aside from the general impact, it's a bureaucratic nightmare. That's the thing. I don't see how it would be implemented. I mean, Julia Reeder, who's an MEP, has pointed out that despite a year-long debate about their flaws, the MEP Axel Voss, who is proposing this and is tasked with finding compromises in the bill that will have majority support, is trying to drum up support for upload filters and the link tax in general. So you just go, I just don't see how it's viable, apart from hamstringing everyone's internet, where everyone has to go through a single server if you want to upload anything as well.
Anybody who has ever uploaded anything onto YouTube will know what processing is. So long after your video has stopped uploading, your video still isn't published because it's being, crawled over by, various computer programs. And all you get on the screen is processing ...
Yes.
And, basically, this could be the case for anybody who just uploads a tweet with a picture attached to it.
Yes. Oh, for goodness sake. Anyway,
I mean, tweets have also been highlighted in this, because if you put up a tweet, and you link to an article, then
I'm sorry.
It will show a title and perhaps the picture of that particular article.
I've just had a terrible
seemed to basically be ripping off that media company.
I've just had a terrible thought. What happens if you have a tweet that links to another tweet?
Oh, well, yeah, well put, because everything is technically published. So
and how much of it extends to
links to basically, if you retweet my tweet,
yes, and your tweet contains a link,
yes,
then who has to get the permission? Do you all need the permission?
Well,
do you all pay the tax?
I need the permission, but you would more than likely need my permission.
Yes,
you may in fact need my permission and their permission.
Honestly, this just sounds like, I don't know, the idea of consent forms for sex once again, right?
Yes.
I don't know if you've seen the South Park episode where they go around in the morning.
Means yes.
And
from the newspaper.
Yes. And they collect all the consent forms from the people who've previously taken people to bed. And he's like, "Oh, did you go down on her?" It's like, "Oh yeah, don't forget that's a separate consent form."
Well, also remember that, channels like Dave Cullen's, like my own, like Sargon's, who basically have bits of articles, of headlines. Imagine, those channels. So basically take Sargon's, because he's the most well-known in this case.
He's the big bear, yeah.
He's been doing this for years now.
Yes, about 4 years.
How many of his videos will he be allowed to keep up?
I'm curious to see as well because again, you've got the idea of fair use at the moment, right? So when they try and take something of his down, how will they be, if he denies them permission to even discuss the video that he has created? because it would be in violation of his copyright over his voiceover, then how will they even discuss it?
Well, you know how it is. They don't discuss it with him at all. Nobody discusses anything.
Exactly.
He either takes it down or they take it down for him. Because, knowing how the European Union works and knowing how Germany operated in, with Facebook,
oh, yes.
It may well be a matter of once the platform has been informed, they have 48 hours to do something, or else they will be fined 50 million euros or 10% of their global turnover, whichever of those two figures is higher. You know the approach.
I do the approach.
They then don't come to you and say, would you be so kind? And then start a debate this particular article or that particular article. They may then just go through it all and just, rip it all to shreds.
I would love if they said you have 48 hours to remove this video and then linked the video, and then he charged the link tax to them for linking his video without his permission. It beggars belief. Anyway, I don't want to linger.
The reason I brought up Sargon of Akkad is because it wouldn't just be any videos he does in future. It would be the legacy videos.
His entire catalogue, yes. Yes, it's horrendous.
So he would still remain with all his subscribers, but effectively the bulk of everything he has put up over the years would be gone.
Yes, he'd be left with...
There's hardly anything that Sargon has ever put up that hasn't got any headlines in or a link or reference to some article. And of course, there is this point that I would just like to make, because that lady that you mentioned, whose name I've already forgotten.
Julia Reeder.
Yes. She did mention that there is something that I believe is called the Berne Treaty, which is an international agreement which allows people to effectively quote news sources and whatever.
Yes.
And this unilateral decision by the European Union flies in the face of that.
Of course.
So effectively, there is as such an international agreement, an international piece of legislation, and they're simply ignoring it.
Silly Sailor says, "Stop mentioning Sargon. You're giving them more of an excuse." Oh dear.
We can always mention T.J. Kirk instead, then, shall we? By the way, when did T.J. Kirk become the amazing atheist again? When did that happen?
I have no idea, because I'm not familiar with T.J. Kirk.
Oh, am I talking about someone you've never heard of?
I'm afraid so.
I am so sorry. He's bigger than Sargon. That's why I immediately swung from Sargon to T.J. Kirk.
I see.
I believe they've been on the odd stream once or twice together.
Oh, potentially. I'm sure I've heard the name. I've just never partaken of any of his content.
The reason I ask about this amazing atheist thing, just to see whether anybody in the chat knows this, even though I'm not even seeing the chat at the moment, is because he changed from being the amazing atheist to T.J. Kirk. And the reason he did so was because he felt YouTube was clamping down too hard on anybody who touched upon subject matter that they thought wasn't advertiser friendly. So if he was called the amazing atheist, he would be seen as an atheist channel first and foremost, and therefore would be demonetized for everything. So he went from that to T.J. Kirk, but he since seems to have moved back again.
Maybe maybe he has
aware as to when that actually happened.
Maybe he has more information on the terrible algorithm than we do.
It could be. I mean, this is a man who will, of course, look down upon the puny little insects that are people like myself, around 20,000, because he is over 1 million. He has over 1 million subscribers.
You keep mentioning your 20,000. I think you're just still chuffed. It's like honey running over the tongue.
I mean, you can't blame me for mentioning my 20,000. I mean, it's like my mentioning that I've been retweeted by my good friend Jordan Peterson.
How many subscribers was it that you have?
20,000.
He is calling his streams The Amazing Atheist so that he can play reruns of his old content and people can find it, says Mike Sanders.
Oh, okay. Well,
So
I've learned something then, because everything
that's
seems to now be branded back to Amazing Atheist. His Twitter, his YouTube, everything. So that's why I was somewhat surprised.
perhaps you've learned something. I mean, that's a rare occurrence. We had one factoid that the Britisher didn't know last stream, but this stream we have one, and it's quite early on. I mean, really, we could get another one in.
Oh, I mean, trust me, I am not. I'm afraid I am not Jeeves. I am more Worcester.
I mean, you are a brain in the jar, which has been running off of Victorian technology for the past 200 years. You know, test.
I am more Worcester than Jeeves, I'm afraid. I think I think you've got an inkling from some of our direct messages as to what for a chaotic persona I am. I don't know what I'm doing in 20 minutes' time at most times of the day.
So I have noticed. I've also. It's quite funny. I always end up talking to you much more posh, shall we say, than perhaps my ordinary way. I just feel like it's something we slip into to speak.
I am glad to have that effect on you.
Proper Queen's English and all that. I'm capable of doing it, but I'm aware I'm affecting it perhaps more than usual.
Well, is it the Queen's English, or are you just dropping the expletives?
Well, I don't typically use that many expletives myself anyway.
Oh, well, so there you go. I'm all the more proud of you now.
Indeed. I don't see much use. I mean, there is a time and a place for expletive.
Well, this is just it. People always say to me that, I'm, I never swear and whatever, and, how sort of Puritan it is of myself. But the thing is that, there can be occasions in which even I swear. But when I swear, oh my, people take notice.
Silly Sailor.
That's what then makes it a proper expletive. Because
yes.
If it is just peppered throughout your entire speech, then one day when you actually hit your thumb with the hammer when you're trying to bang in a nail and you swear, it's meaningless because you say those things all the time anyway.
Yes. Just to address some of the super chat stuff, Silly Sailor says, you disable the super chat option, don't you want to be paid? Sadly, I need 1,000 subscribers in order to access super chat. You no longer need a certain number of hours watched, but in order to get monetization on the channel, you do need 4,000 hours of watched stuff.
That is cruel, because I know someone who went to great length to get her hours, her requisite hours, so that she could finally enable that again. Because she had the 1,000 subscribers,
Indeed.
but she needed the hours because she hadn't really done much for a long time on her channel. So when she came back, she desperately needed to somehow do ludicrously long live streams and whatever in order to get the hours back.
I see.
That in the end they just forwent that is somewhat cruel.
Basically, I will try my best to read out as many questions and messages from the chat that I can. If you feel so inclined, I have put a link to my PayPal, and you can donate there. But I will do my best to ensure that your message gets read out. It's just paypal.me/not-so-obvious. Dominic says, is codswallop an expletive, Richard?
I wouldn't have it under expletive. No.
No. We used to.
I would say it's a dismissive language. Basically, something is codswallop in the same way as that something is nonsense.
Indeed.
But I wouldn't say that is sort of, an expletive as such.
Yes. I had a person I used to work with, and he would every single morning. I was in the military at the time, so I basically we would have breakfast together about 7 o'clock in the morning, and every single morning he would bemoan the fact that this was the worst effing breakfast he had ever had. It didn't matter that it was basically the same breakfast every morning, nor that he had hated the breakfast that he had had out on the weekends, nor the fact that his lunch was always the worst meal he had ever had, nor that dinner was the worst meal that he'd ever had, and that this was the worst day he had ever had, on a par with the day that his grandmother had died and the day which he got his diploma from university. So it was very difficult. I think a lot of people use expletives when they can't think of something. It's sort of a replacement for the word
Yes. I would also say that the military is not really known to be, very restrained when it comes to language.
Indeed. Well, yes, but
There
at
are
least
certain
in the
environments
military,
where you expect there to be a certain coarseness. Let's put it like that.
yes, but the military itself is it's direct. So people think that that means that we swear all the time, and yes, that's true to a certain extent. But typically, if you're one of these people who swears all the time for no good reason, you're likely to be ribbed more than you are to be sort of venerated.
Unless you're a drill sergeant, then you can get away with everything, I believe.
Well, when it's funny, yes. And certainly in a certain environment, then it is useful. But you run the risk, certainly, of desensitizing your audience if you use too many.
I mean, I can honestly say that I too worked once in my younger years, long ago, in an environment where swearing was just it was the language. And you would be surprised. I mean, this was an establishment with people in pinstripe suits and silk ties.
Oh, yes.
And yet it was just relentless. And I was as much guilty of it as was everybody else because it was extremely stressful. And
yes.
It kind of was one of the valves with which you kind of let go of some of the pressure. But yes, one has since kind of tidied oneself up a bit.
Has one?
Yes,
I wouldn't be able to tell. Speaking of speech and speaking, I have a challenge for you this evening, which is what I want the main bulk of this stream to be.
You said something rather ominous in that regard, and you haven't let on too much. So I'm just wondering how much of a fool I am going to make myself this evening.
Not at all, but I am curious because I'm sure some people in the chat are as well, about where you sit, for instance, on the political compass.
Oh dear God! No.
Because obviously you have many debates with our anarchist friend, the anarchist agent.
Yes, anarchist agent. Yes, yeah. he was at it. Well, he wasn't, but his associate was at it again today, and then unleashing his hordes. Who they don't send you a tweet; they send you one tweet followed by a follow-on tweet, followed by another follow-on tweet, followed by another follow-on tweet. So they're kind of sending you a chapter of kind of economic doctrine,
Yes.
And you wonder, should I even reply to this?
So
eventually you just think, no, I think I'll just leave it because otherwise I'll just get 14 more tweets from the same person.
So originally I wanted to have the academic agent. Silly Sailor says, "What's wrong with sailor language?" I'm just going. I think that your sailor language, if it's silly, is probably different to the sailor language we're talking about.
Well, it's actually interesting that you should say that Silly Sailor should bring this up because one of the gentlemen with whom I dealt with at the time when I was turning the air blue myself was previously a member of the Merchant Navy. And he indeed had a way of, speaking. Let's put it like that.
Yes, he did use words.
When the mood took him, let's put it like that. So yes, sailors do seem to have a particular knack for that kind of thing.
So I have here a political compass test. I did want the academic agent on for this stream, so you could do one concurrently without arguing. I may have him on for a separate stream.
You see, I can always
get him away.
One of the main flaws of this, and this is that, of course, I will be put on the spot with each one of these questions, and then won't have much time to think about it.
Well,
I like to kind of stew over these things, but by all means, let's see where this will lead. No doubt I'll turn out to be some kind of communist.
Can you imagine? I do believe. Have we lost you?
Well, I'm still here.
Oh, you are still here. Yes. The general idea is that we can go through this at our leisure, And if you want to discuss and talk about a particular point, and we can have a little chat
I mean,
about
I can honestly say I have never taken one of these tests.
Marvelous. That makes it all the better.
It'll be stayed away from them.
It will be pure and unadulterated.
So
then,
therefore,
right?
for all my desire to stay away from these things, I'm now being dragged into it anyway.
Oh yes, and you can't get out of it because oh look, you've dropped from the call. How did that happen? Here we have, as you may notice, the speaker.org. Speaker.org is will tell us basically where you're shifting on the political compass as you do it, and it has this little slider here between very much agree and very much disagree. The questions will appear up here. I think it's going to take us about half an hour to go through.
Oh, good God, half an hour.
But it should be fun to talk about each individual point. This could go horribly wrong, but we shall see.
I can see this going. I can see this going horribly, horribly wrong. But yes, here we are.
Here we go. So, Mr. Britisher, each individual enjoys bodily autonomy and has rights that no other individual or group may violate. How do you plead?
So basically, you've got those. You've got those 4 buttons really to either side of the center.
You do. You could be neutral on this. You could very much agree. You could very much disagree. And the little button over here will move around accordingly.
Well, I mean, this begs certain questions as to what this question itself would really entail. So, you have bodily autonomy. Yes, I agree. You have bodily autonomy, but is that absolute? So.
This is why we have a little bit of agreement, but
yes.
Not totally.
So basically, you are not free to just simply walk into MI6 headquarters, are you?
You are not, no.
So therefore, you don't really have complete bodily autonomy, because one has to be able to prevent you from doing some things that are sort of, which is kind of within the greater interest of the group, so to speak.
Now, here's the kicker with this, and this is the inherent flaw, I believe, with all political compass tests of this nature. Do you agree a little bit, or do you disagree a little bit?
No, I would say I would agree a little bit. I would say, as a whole, yes, we are all basically physically autonomous and should be allowed to do what we want, except there will be certain exceptions to that. There needs to be some exceptions to that. So therefore, I would say, yes, I agree somewhat, but I don't agree strongly.
So question 2, or statement 2, I should say. Well, individuals have the freedom to decide what they knowingly and voluntarily consume. So this is the question on, things like ingredients lists on products, to not be forced to have something that they don't want to consume.
Well, basically, I would read that to say that manufacturers have to put the ingredients on the packet.
Yes, and that's and the sort of subderivatives thereof.
So if, I mean, are we understanding this the same way? Because the first time I read that question, I was somewhat baffled. So if that is the way we're reading it, then I would say I agree somewhat.
I can tell there's going to be a theme of somewhat.
Yes.
Throughout. Slavery is acceptable in certain circumstances, such as punishment for a crime. Noting that this doesn't put on conditions for slavery, it makes no difference and bounds between the idea of slavery as something akin to indentured servitude.
Yes, I mean, I am just thinking this through, thinking to myself, I cannot actually think of an example in which that would apply.
Typically, debt was the way it applied.
I would just simply say I strongly disagree.
Good choice. I mean, that's your choice. Here's one that's been in the public noise recently. Freedom of expression should be unhindered by government, regardless of the content.
Now, every instinct of mine says strongly agree. But of course, again, there are certain things. I mean, do you really want people to put up how to build bombs? Do you understand what I mean?
Yes,
So that would
like
be somewhat agree.
the
But I
Defender.
think, with that caveat in mind, I nonetheless think that the message needs to be as strong as possible. Hence, I strongly agree.
Good. Dominic says, yes, one of the crimes that would give you slavery is the crime of being black.
Well, no, that was in the olden days. Now it would be the crime of being white and male.
Of course, yes. No, of course. Don't you see? It's reversed now. Hate speech should be banned.
Well, Mr. Not So Obvious, I will let you guess what my opinion on that is.
Hate speech is far too vaguely defined to be able to be banned with any kind of consistency.
Well,
and so
I strongly disagree. I mean, I think
that's relatively easy to deal with. The control of communications by the government is necessary to prevent the spread of ideas that may undermine the stability of the nation. I am trying very hard to say some of these with a straight face.
Yes. Again, I can see certain exceptions, but by and large, I would just strongly disagree.
In a way, I'd like to hide this until the end.
That's why you're keeping the chat there now, I see.
As much as possible. Provision of the internet. Now, this is something, of course, that has been proposed in the EU, I believe, that the internet now is such a necessary utility to creating educated and technologically literate individuals, that they should socialize the internet and make it available, at least to an extent, free of charge.
Well, I could even imagine that to a certain extent.
Well, they've already made a lot of progress towards doing it, I believe, in eastern France.
Well, the argument I would see that is strongest in support of that is because we seem to be more and more going towards you having to submit your taxes online. So basically, if you can't submit your taxes without an internet, then isn't it at least beholden on the government to provide you with the facility with which to actually be able to submit your taxes?
Indeed.
But on the other hand, yeah,
well, so you take
strange sounds now, aren't I?
Well, you take somewhere like Japan, for instance, where I don't believe there is an inch of Japan aside from perhaps the tops of some mountains, and even that is being generous, that you cannot there is internet everywhere, and it is a minimum speed that they have a requirement for. They have a minimum speed that must be provided if you buy internet.
I mean, my view as a whole would be somewhat disagree. So I can see there being a point. I'm not going to be all academic agent about this, but at the same time, yes, I do see this as yet again the nanny state having to do things for us.
Silly Sailor says you could go to the library to do your taxes.
You could? Oh, yes, of course, yes. But I think in that case, the library better start getting more computers.
State-mandated internet cafes. That's what I'm hearing, for free of charge. But paid.
The coffee there would also have to be free, wouldn't it?
I don't think so. You'd spill it all over your monitor when you saw the amount of tax you had to pay.
People in order to pay for the state-mandated internet cafes.
Yes, indeed. People should be free to engage or abstain from religious activity that does not violate the rights of others.
I would strongly agree.
Likewise, yes. Let me see. Blasphemy laws should be reinstated.
Blasphemy laws. Yes. I think you've got an idea where they can go with those blasphemy laws. I strongly disagree. No, you're strongly agreeing.
I wondered whether or not you did. Dominic says there are some places which provide free Wi-Fi. Yes, a lot of places do. Unfortunately, they're not secure.
Yes, they're kind of hacker central, aren't they?
They are, particularly if it comes to the point where everyone must do their tax returns in the local Costa Coffee or Starbucks. government action should neither aid nor attack any religion.
Now, once upon a time, I would have more than likely agreed strongly with that.
I suppose it depends, because so take from my perspective, I would say I would strongly agree with this statement. And that's because I believe that the action should be taken. Action should be taken against actions. And so you can say what you like. I don't care what you think, because if you are not perpetrating, for instance, let's take something like a phrase from the Old Testament, which says, if you have an unruly child who doesn't respect their parents, you should get the whole village together. You should take them outside the village walls and stone them to death, because it's better to have a respectful child than not.
Yep.
Right.
So
now,
in the end, you just don't have a child at all. Yes.
Yes. So, and you make another one, right? If you can't succeed, try again. Well, we'll get it next time, dear. So, in my mind, if you believe that this is a practice which should go ahead, how very barbaric, I don't really care, provided you're not actually stoning children to death. And so
I fully understand that. I completely comprehend where you're coming from, and as I say, as a principle, it's perfectly sound.
Again, I think Mike Sanders in chat makes a salient point. He says, "Does attack mean criticize?" Because yes, like for instance, the Christian doctrine has been heavily criticized for its stance on homosexuality, for instance, which is something which no one would dare do to a certain other religion at the moment.
Well, the way I'm reading this story is basically by means of government shouldn't favor a religion. So it shouldn't favor one religion over others.
Yes.
And that is where I would actually these days sort of somewhat, not strongly, but somewhat agree that government should have the right to favor a religion over others.
Sort of the state religion, for instance.
Yes. So in this regard, I would have to somewhat disagree with this particular statement.
Very well.
And I think you can see where perhaps my thinking is in that regard, that I would say in this case, even though I'm an atheist, I regard this as a Christian nation. And I think that it therefore should effectively be upon the government to effectively see that as the cultural and religious heritage of the country.
Silly Sailor says, so you're an anti-disestablishmentarianist. Hashtag not sailor language.
Someone has been watching Blackadder again, hasn't he?
I offer you my greatest contribularities. That's one of my favorite lines from that show. Here's an interesting one, though, following on from your aid or abet. Religious organizations should not be exempt from taxation.
I mean, at the moment, I believe they are exempt from taxation.
They are. All churches, for instance, in the UK, and religious organizations can claim themselves to be charitable organizations.
Yes, but I mean, I would look at it and sort of say, when I was 20 years old, I would definitely say they shouldn't be exempt. I now look at it and I just think, well, it's not really as if they are corporations.
No.
And all the income really is spent either on overheads, on looking after old buildings, which are listed buildings and can't be used for anything else anyway, or for charitable purposes. So if you tax them, all you're really doing is making sure that less gets spent on charitable purposes.
Indeed. I also think that enough of a case can be made. Like, you shouldn't exempt. I mean, you could exempt a non-charitable religious organization. So, for instance, you could make it incumbent upon the religious organization to prove that they were performing a charitable duty. Because
it basically falls back under the last question when I interpreted the question as, should the state be allowed to show some bias?
Well, it depends, because is the religious organization acting as such, or is it acting as a charity? And therefore it's exempt from taxation. And this is sort of surplus to the fact that it is, in fact, a religious organization.
Yes, because we all know that there are certain organizations that some people claim to be cults, and they then like taking those people to court because they say they're a cult. And a great many people, including myself, would look at them and think, you're not really a proper religion. You're little else than a brainwashing organization.
Hashtag not all cults.
Of course, yes. Therefore, therefore, I would have absolutely no problem to see those organizations treated with a certain amount of bias that one wouldn't necessarily extend to other religious organizations. So that's why I think there may be the need for these various organizations to be treated differently. So religious organizations should not be exempt from taxation. I would somewhat disagree with that.
Very well. Let's get the next one up.
So have I been made a fascist yet on our cross or not?
Shall we have a look and see where you are? Ooh, just slightly right-leaning centrist at the moment. So we're all right, and you're leaning towards the libertarian side of things in the downward arc. You have nothing to fear if you have nothing to hide is a valid statement.
Strongly disagree.
And there you go. There's only one situation which I can see I would agree with that statement.
And what would that be?
That would be in terms of pravda.
Pravda. You'll have to give us a little more detail than just naming the Soviet newspaper.
The Russian word for truth, don't you know? Pravda is an organization which Elon Musk wishes to create, that basically ratifies and rates journalists on the integrity of their work. And he wants to create a massive archive of all, which obviously this EU thing is going to massively
this would be Eurojourn again, wouldn't it?
Yes, but he wants to create this archive of all the work and attribute it to each individual journalist. And then he wants to basically have a rating system for journalists. So if people say they've read something by Owen Jones, and then they go to his rating on Pravda and find that it's through the floor, well, they're not really going to take his article with much seriousness. And it's amazing how many journalists have got up in arms about it.
And of course, that would not be open to abuse at all, would it, Mr. Musk?
Oh, of course not. The idea that, as well, that I mean, it's not without its flaws. The other idea, of course, being that basically news organizations would no longer be able to go back retroactively and alter a news article to show that they had previously been correct when they had been incorrect, because the archived copy would still show the flaw.
Yeah.
And that side of things. Anyway, there was an uproar about the violation of their privacy and so on. But you think if you are a journalist with any kind of integrity, you wouldn't.
But he has actually, his choice was the word Pravda, was it? Because as I say, that was the Soviet newspaper.
It was indeed
the Pravda. And if you recall correctly, I mean, I don't know.
It still exists today, interestingly.
Oh, well, there you go.
Nobody really buys it.
Yes, I mean, it was once one of the sources of information out of the Soviet Union. You know, when the word I can't even say it, Kremlinology was still up and about, because everyone was trying to kind of read the tea leaves and kind of work out what was happening in the Kremlin. There was two sources, really. One was Pravda, and the other was the official Soviet news organization. You know, the equivalent of a Reuters or the Associated Press.
I see.
And that was TASS. And those were the two organizations everybody looked to. So it's just funny that should now be reborn in, you know, with Elon Musk. I mean, perhaps he sees himself as a cosmonaut, and therefore he's.
I certainly think he wishes to transcend media bias, which I don't think is going to be plausible with this.
On the other hand, with his name, perhaps therefore he's got a certain sympathy for the Russians, because obviously a citizen of Moscow would be a Muscovite. Do I get a point for that?
Yes, +1 Britisher points. I will be keeping track of those over time. I may have a little get someone to draw up a little infographic for you.
So government transparency is vital to ensuring accountability. Yes, I mean, how can one not strongly agree with that?
Indeed. I don't know, Academic Agent would find a way. Government surveillance should be expanded even more than it already is to combat terrorism.
You see, once upon a time I would have strongly disagreed with that. And then they started catching all these terrorists. I mean,
now they catch the terrorists and then they give them funding to inform on other terrorists and then are surprised when they create more terrorists.
Yes, but it is a sort of a strange one because, given the situation, given the activities of a certain minority in this country, we now suddenly are under a huge surveillance umbrella.
Indeed.
Which otherwise no one would ever have dreamt up. I mean, in the days of the IRA, nothing like this was happening.
Yes.
Then even the IRA never really charged around London in a white van and then started stabbing people.
You have to wonder how surveillance could be expanded currently in a way that you would agree with. However, I mean, there was talk about banning apps like WhatsApp because they used end-to-end encryption.
Yeah. No, I fully understand where you're going there. I would look at it from this perspective. They say that there is something like 3,000 terrorist suspects under constant surveillance here in the country.
Yes.
But there are 20,000 further suspects, which they can't survey 24 hours a day.
I wonder where you've pulled the figure 20,000 from.
It's just what I recall from. Oh, yes, sorry.
Is it because you're keeping track?
They're all my subscribers. Yes, of course. I was able to mention it.
I'm sorry, I couldn't help myself.
That's when you sort of realize, well, yes, perhaps one is short-handed there. I mean, in previous years, I was much more skeptical. You see, whenever they were telling us about how many terrorist suspects there were and whatever, I was always the first one to say, well, they would say that, wouldn't they? Because they need to justify their budgets. Yes. And given that all this is cloak and dagger, we're never going to see whether this is really true or not. So, in a way, when it comes to the security services, this is a crisis which they will never allow to stop in the public imagination.
You will also notice that that there's very little transparency on how many plots are foiled and that sort of thing, because you get information after one has failed to be foiled. They say we have. I mean, I used to get more information when I was in the military, but you would get this thing where, they would say, "Oh, a bloke has run a van into people," and the police say there was no way we could have known. We foiled 35 plots or whatever in the last month, and that sort of thing. But you don't get a regular count that comes in.
You don't get a regular count as such, but you do. You do hear once in a while of these foiled plots. I mean, there was just recently there was that entirely female plot, wasn't there?
Oh yes,
where two sisters and a mother all wanted to blow themselves up in various places.
Don't forget that women are not as violent as men, ladies and gentlemen.
Of course.
Yes.
And when it comes to there was that chap with all the knives close to Westminster that was stopped. So there have been various plots, and I do believe they do keep some sort of count of it.
They will. The issue is the transparency. Silly Sailor says Ray strikes again for the all-female plot, but I doubt it. It's the transparency on a relatively regular basis.
Yes, so you're told the plot is failed, but how the hell do you know that ever happened?
well, there's that, and there's also the idea that you shouldn't quota these things, obviously, but you don't get this idea that the security services are particularly competent until they are making apologies for having failed to do one plot and explaining that they've foiled another X number. And you go,
of course, they charged into some house. Was it in Leeds? And
"Ugh,
accidentally, on purpose, shot someone, and then later it turns out that the two gentlemen in the house may have had beards and were Asian, but had nothing to do with terrorism.
oh, good grief. Yeah,
That was a few years ago, wasn't it?
I do recall.
They kicked down the front door and charged in at something like 2:30 in the morning. And then one of them had the audacity to come down the staircase in his pajamas asking what was up, and he just happened to get shot.
Oh, do they use beanbag rounds at least? Goodness. I hope.
And yes, not only was he shot, after that they charged him with possession of child pornography,
Ugh,
which then eventually they also dropped.
good grief.
So it was almost, we've got this wrong. Well, we'll charge him with something else then.
Oh, and something particularly heinous that will destroy his standing in the community.
Let's look at his computer. Well, surely she could be deemed not to be 18. So let's charge him with child porn. And eventually they had to drop that too. Yes.
Grief. So, how do you feel about government surveillance?
Government surveillance. I'm sort of torn either way. I'm almost tempted to just keep it in the middle.
We can leave it in the middle if you.
Yes, I think I'll be non-committal on that one.
Very well. People should be secure in their person, in their home, in their property, and in their communications.
Strongly agree.
Indeed. In order to solve crimes, the police need the power to conduct searches and seizures without consent or a warrant.
Strongly disagree.
Yes, these are the nice, easy ones we like, Sexual orientation, preference, gender, or gender identity should have no impact on the government's treatment of individuals.
I would somewhat disagree.
Okay, care to expand on that one?
Because I see I see transgenderism as a mental disorder.
It is. It's called gender dysphoria.
So in that regard, I think it should indeed have an effect on how people like that are treated, because they shouldn't be treated as people who are necessarily in command completely of all their faculties.
Mm-hmm. Particularly as the jury is out on treatment at the moment. Because it's not clear.
Isn't it Johns Hopkins University who actually, University Hospital? I always forget to add the hospital bit. That they refuse to do any more
reassignments.
Yes, any more reassignment surgeries, and they were the hospital that led the way in pioneering all the reassignment surgery techniques.
It's because the statistically negligible impact of gender reassignment
on suicide rates. Yes,
indeed, and that sort of thing. So the jury is very much out, despite what the left would have you believe. But there you go. The government should have the authority to define, license, or restrict personal relationships.
The government should have the authority to restrict personal relationships already rings alarm bells.
It does.
What define and license in that regard would mean is all the more. I mean, as I say, if you are looking at it, with rose-tinted spectacles, you would see it differently than if you look at it through very critical view. So if you look at it skeptically, you would say government should have the authority to define, license, or restrict. Well, surely not. They can't tell people what relationships they should be allowed to have until the relationship is between a Muslim immigrant and his 10-year-old child bride.
Yes.
And then comes the question, should government have the right, should it have the authority to define, license, or restrict personal relationships? If you look at it in that light, you then suddenly go, oh, I very much agree.
Yeah, you make a salient point.
If you I don't know if you remember, if you've heard of this particular case in Sweden, there was a leaflet.
Oh, this is awful.
Where they were basically telling people from Syria and whatever that they're child brides, that there was a kind of problem in Swedish society of accepting this and so on. But in no point anywhere in the government leaflet did it say this is illegal. You can't have a child bride in Sweden.
Sweden withdraws a brochure with child marriage tips for migrants.
Well, I don't.
Yes.
I think child marriage tips is perhaps a little unfair. I think that's perhaps slightly biased.
The brochure was called, in translated obviously, information for those married to a child, including an explanation that marrying an under 18 is forbidden in the country and that continuing to live with your bride is inappropriate. A child bride would be treated as a lone youngster without a parent or guardian. And one line read, since children under the age of 15 have an absolute right to protection from sexual acts, it is improper for you to live together if the child is under 15. The biggest failing noting that the word prison isn't present. Gives a bit of response of an advice and tips on how to respond if you have a child in a relationship.
Yeah.
The Liberal leader said facepalm, unacceptably flat. The brochure has to be withdrawn. Even Sweden's Minister for Children, the Elderly and Gender Equality said she had misgivings. Right, obviously. It is not permitted to enter.
That sounds like Theresa May.
Yes, this cannot be
the Swedish Theresa May, who has misgivings when something goes wrong.
It is not permitted to enter into child marriage. That cannot be compromised, and the information on it must be crystal clear. We must be strong and stable on this issue.
Because if you remember with Theresa May, the reason her name springs to mind is because, of course, she was always trying to reduce immigration into this country into the tens of thousands. And we were always told what a success as a Home Secretary she was. And, of course, this pretty much every year of her being a Home Secretary, that was a stated goal. And it was never achieved. And I remember once, I think she might have been interviewed on Newsnight and whatever. And suddenly that changed from a goal to an ambition.
Of course.
And that's why when I hear the Swedish Minister for the Elderly and Children saying, oh, I have slight misgivings, that reminds me of Theresa May saying, oh, well, yes, but that was merely an ambition.
Oh, for goodness sake.
Politicians, eh? So, yes, when it comes to government should have the authority, I would say I somewhat agree. Because, as I say, I would strongly agree that it should stay out of anything that has to do with adults. But at the same time, when it comes to things like child abuse and whatever, then that is very much an area where we want them to do something, and not intervene because they're afraid they might otherwise be thought of as a racist.
Indeed. Consenting adults should be free to choose their own sexual practices and personal relationships.
I very, very strongly agree with that.
I'm afraid there's only strongly agree, but we'll have to take it.
I remember asking an MP once why he was so keen to have his hand down my underpants. I was trying to get through to him, as in, what you are proposing is is somewhat beyond the pale, and he just wouldn't let go of the government line. So then when I put it to him like that, he just decided to be offended rather than actually see the light, if you know what I mean.
Oh yes, or see the darkness in your trousers. Here's a more controversial one then. Access to abortion should be regulated by the government.
Now, what do you take that to mean?
So to me, that means that you should only, if you want it to be regulated, you can only get an abortion if there is a state-mandated reason for it.
Or if it basically fits within a state-mandated time frame.
Yes, as well.
You can't have an abortion, say, 2 weeks before there would be a natural birth. So I guess that is the way I would read that.
Mm.
I would somewhat agree with that.
Blaywar says immigration restriction isn't hard. It's a matter of willpower. You're an island and people aren't swimming across the channel, for goodness sake. Although we do have a tunnel that runs underneath the channel that migrants have been attempting to run through.
Well, wasn't there a oh my god, I'm trying to remember his name. Wasn't he a captain or a major something? And he was the first chap to swim the channel.
Yes, and then a number of people have done it, including.
Oh yes, yeah. By now, a great many people have done it, but I think it was in Victorian times that there was some kind of officer who swam the channel, and he kind of got hooked on fame, and therefore he kind of became this kind of daredevil who did all sorts of crazy things. So I think he swam the channel several times eventually because he kind of needed to do it again, if you know what I mean, in order to reinstate, to kind of keep his fame alive. And
well, I've done it twice.
I believe in the end he drowned going down Niagara Falls in a barrel.
Good grief.
So that gives you an idea as to kind of what he became. He kind of became a sort of fame prostitute. He couldn't let go.
Every time I think that you can't top your last anecdote, you get a man who died throwing himself off Niagara Falls in a barrel in Victorian times.
But if I'm not mistaken, I believe there was a brand of matches named after him. But that's why I'm so annoyed with myself that I can't remember his name.
Was it Swan for swan diving off the Niagara Falls?
No, I'm afraid not. Yes. Nice try. But anyway, where are we? Criminal laws should be limited to violation of the rights of others through force or fraud. Yes, indeed.
Yes. Philip Mason says, is the man you're thinking of called Webb?
Yes, I believe that's it. Yes. Was that Captain Webb, I believe?
There we are. No victim, no crime is a valid statement.
Again, I strongly agree.
Oh, really? Strongly agree with that one.
Yes, because well, I feel that falls very much into the same clause as before. Basically, unless there is actually an infringement of someone's rights, of someone's personage, I just do not understand how something can be criminal. So
yes, it comes down to
if you are smoking marijuana, whom are you harming?
Very true.
Please show me whom you are, whose rights you are infringing upon, whom you are harming. Where is the victim? What have you actually supposedly committed? In that sphere that I just feel, look, just leave people alone.
And then I suppose it just becomes an argument over what is a victim and what is harm.
I mean, what is it? It was there was the famous Spanner case. That's it, the Spanner case. I believe they actually appealed their case, and this is always worrying when you think of Count Dankula, because here were some gentlemen who were having gay sex with each other in some sort of strange orgy.
As you do, yeah.
I believe there was all sorts of BDSM involved, and I think they went quite. I think they went quite a bit further than most people might indulge, if you know what I mean.
So you mean they did some sort of Britisher DSM?
Oh yes, indeed, yes. I believe there were nails involved and all sorts of things. So they went the extra mile, if you know what I mean.
Oh yes, you could put on.
Somehow this emerged. I don't know if someone told a friend of theirs or please don't ask me. I don't know exactly.
You were only in the corner, right? You didn't see anything.
Precisely. But they all ended up being charged, wait for this, for assault on each other.
Right, even though they had consented.
And so they all said, we're all grown-ups, there are no minors involved, we had all consented, what's going on? And the judge, and these sort of things have occasionally reappeared in courtrooms. Yes. And in that particular case, it was basically said, you cannot consent for certain things.
Well, we had a safe word.
So basically, you cannot consent. So you know, people immediately brought up things like boxing and whatever. I mean, if you can consent to being hit by your opponent in the ring until you effectively, you know, are unconscious, then how could you not consent to this? I mean, given that nobody had any lasting damage or anything like that.
Should Silly Sailor says, by this logic, should we make dueling legal? I can't remember. Sorry.
Where are we going with that?
So you're saying that if both members, he's saying if both members of who consent to duel one another, I suppose it would conflict with the right to life.
Yes, I think there is a certain amount of lethal force involved there.
If
everybody walks away from it afterwards, then I still fail to see the problem.
What was it? I believe it was the Finns. Was it the Finns? They have something where you go onto a small island, you have your duel, and then you leave. And there's a specific name for that kind of duel.
Isn't that rather a Viking thing rather than?
It might be, yes.
I believe they have 3 shields each.
That was right, yes.
And then once all 3 shields are broken, basically then you have no more shield. So basically, the other guy might then have a sword and a shield, but your 3 shields have been broken, and therefore you now must fight on with the sword.
The thing that I find amusing about that is if you have broken 3 shields, you're probably quite knackered.
Yes, your arm will more than likely also not be in too good a condition.
Yes.
I think eventually it was made illegal when I think it was some rather well-known poet or something like that got killed by some chap. It may even be I'm not sure. He may even have been a member of the Danish royal family or something like that. So this was a fairly high-ranking fight between two chaps that were, you know, who were of note. And they were fighting over the same maiden, if you know what I mean.
Yes, the equivalent of knightly battles.
Yes, and after that, one then decided, look, folks, we're no longer really Vikings. Things have moved on a bit. So maybe we should stop this.
Perhaps we should stop beating each other to death with shields.
Yes, you would actually wonder what state your sword is in.
Yes.
Once you have smashed to pieces 3 shields with it.
One would imagine that you would use a mace or some other form of blunt implement rather than a sharply edged weapon. But if we don't...
Being Vikings, they would more than likely go at each other with axes, wouldn't they?
Indeed. There is quite a funny... It supposedly... It was in a book of fiction, but the quote is supposedly taken from an actual arms tutor, where the student is asking how to deal with different weapons when it comes to his weapons of choice, which are a long dagger or a dirk, and they have a soft sort of breaker dagger, which is designed to catch the blade of whatever is swinging at you, and you can twist it, and it will either break the blade or it will unsettle it in your opponent's hand, and you can get in quick. And he's going through the list of different things that you should do if your back is to a cliff, say, and you've got someone coming at you. And there are all these different methods of taking down different weapons until he gets to a battle axe. And he says, what happens what do you do if you have to deal with a battle axe? And he says, you jump off the cliff.
Well, it's funny. I mean, what constitutes a battle axe in that case? Because we in our minds, we immediately think of a kind of 2-handed, double-headed axe, don't we? That's what we think of with a battle axe.
But traditionally, it was a single-handed weapon with a large moon-shaped blade and a slight hook on the top.
Well, if you think of a, one of the most notorious weapons was the Francisca, which was actually a throwing axe.
Yes,
and it was used. It was basically Francisca is actually named after the Frankii, so it's the Franks after whom France is named, for the people who need to know.
No, folks, I don't know where he gets this stuff from either. I'm just aware that he knows it.
They became notorious with the late Roman army, the Francisca, Because if if you think of the Romans, they always liked sort of marching up, standing in line, didn't they, with their shield
Yes.
wall,
Making
now
themselves very pretty targets.
approaches, and before they actually come to hand combat, basically an entire wall of men just launches these Francisca axes at the shield wall. Now, the Francisca became notorious because it was capable of smashing a shield. So, okay, you could only do the trick once, but if you then had an entire army, the front line of which has just lost a significant number of shields.
Yes, and they don't have 3 of them.
You can see how that would kind of imbue you with a certain advantage.
Of course, if you want to finish the battle, you should use a Murasami sword.
Oh yes, that's the deadliest of all. I'm told.
It will let you finish.
It will. You will very quickly realize that you are weak and useless.
Thank you very much for that one, Philip Mason. But we must move on with these statements, otherwise we will never get through this. But banned medicinal and recreational drugs should remain illegal.
Oh, you've just tickled me there. Because just today there was I read an article whereby a lady in Northern Ireland who was, I believe, prescribed, don't ask me how, some sort of cannabis oil.
Oh, CBD oil, yeah.
I don't believe it was CBD oil because that is legally available in this country.
Okay.
But it was some other cannabis oil. Now, I'm not an expert in these areas, but it apparently worked for her 10-year-old kid.
Mm-hmm.
And he can have up to 100 seizures a day.
Without it.
Without it.
Mm.
So with having been prescribed this, it worked. The seizures stopped. So apparently he then was under instructions from the Home Office to stop prescribing this.
Yes.
So he then had to stop prescribing it. It basically meant she ran out of it. So eventually, in her desperation, she ended up going to Canada, where she purchased some of it and came back with it.
Mm-hmm.
All of it was seized at the airport.
Yes, as a restricted substance.
And she has now basically called out the government, and she has said, I will keep going back to Canada.
Mm-hmm.
And I will get more of this stuff. And I will get more of this stuff, and I'll travel back here until I get it through the border, because I don't care.
Yes,
because she says, I will sooner have my child illegally alive than legally dead.
Yes.
Because each one of these seizures apparently has got the capacity to kill the child.
Mm-hmm.
So when you look at it like that, this question suddenly stands in stark relief, doesn't it? Because you suddenly realize sometimes these bans are ludicrous.
I am a fan of information, for instance, on my end, of information being provided on things. And then, and I'm also not saying that, provision should be made, from a government's perspective, for these different drugs. But I don't see the need for them to be illegal. If you wish to rot your brain with acid, you will find a way to rot your brain with acid, irrespective of a ban on such a substance, because you cannot totally remove such substances from the underbelly of society, should I say.
We also face this ludicrous war on drugs, which
has caused
failing in now for so many years.
Well, it's bred stronger drugs out of it, and it has caused all of these soft line purveyors of such things to disappear because they get caught. Well, they get removed. And then the only people left are the hardliners.
There's a wonderful example there with my dear friend Michael Howard, who was another one of these pet hates of mine.
Mm-hmm.
He was the first hardline Home Secretary. So basically, until then, Home Secretaries in this country, and for those people who don't know, Home Secretaries are the ones who are in charge of law and order. So they're in charge of policing and whatever. Back then, they were still also in charge of prisons and whatever. But until then, they were fairly reasonable-minded. So I think Ken Clarke, who is still hanging around Parliament today, he was Home Secretary once. So it gives you an idea that there was a day when Home Secretaries weren't this militant.
Mm.
And then Michael Howard was the one who changed this all, who decided to go sort of all Daily Mail on the Home Office. And he famously came out with the line, "Prison works." And he came out with the line, "If you don't want to do the time, don't commit the crime."
Yes.
And he also came out with the line, if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear."
Oh,
So
really? This is all.
yes, he did the triple whammy in this field, and I absolutely loathed the man. And he basically found out that the police really knew who all the marijuana dealers were all across the country. That they were well clued up on the fact that they were mainly these old hippies, who may have been growing some marijuana somewhere in a barn on a farm or something like that, and they were the people who were supplying the local, whatever local demand there was. And he decided, well, we need to clamp down on this. We know who the wrongdoers are, so they have to be arrested. They're acting against the law. And the police advised him, "We don't think this is a good idea, sir." Well, people like that don't tend to listen. So he insisted they all be rounded up and arrested, which then, of course, happened. Now, what happened was that you took this rather soft form of crime, or this soft form of criminal, out of the equation, and yet the demand for marijuana remained.
It did.
So someone was going to fill this gap in the market. Well, now came in very, very violent criminal gangs, and they started. It was these gangs that started bringing in illegal immigrants, effectively locking them in houses where they have to farm marijuana. And if the house is ever found by the police, the only thing they find is an illegal immigrant who doesn't know where he is, has no passport, and effectively is sitting there in his underpants because it's that hot on the premises that he otherwise can't exist. So they can never track the gangs. So now we've got very violent gangs who will, really fight turf wars over this, and in the same time are involved in illegal immigration, people trafficking and slavery. Whereas previously we had a few old hippies.
Yes.
And you look at those two and you think, well, yeah, well done, Michael Howard. You really improved the nation there.
You'll also notice that the hippies weren't really that bothered about breeding super varieties to outcompete the other hippies.
Yes.
Which is now happening. And to the point where some varieties are so strong they have hallucinogenic effects, which never used to happen.
So what are we looking at here? Banned medical and recreational drugs should remain illegal. So I would somewhat disagree.
Very well. Police, fire, and ambulance services should be provided by the academic agent. I mean, the market.
I strongly disagree.
Good choice.
You see, that's why the academic agent wants to make me the new Ray Murasame.
Well, you will.
What is the word he uses? He doesn't use foil. He uses whatever the term is they use in wrestling, don't they, for the bad guy?
I have no idea.
That's what he wants to make of me, because he sees me as an ignoramus when it comes to his Austrian school. I mean, I regard him as an ideologue.
Yeah. Let me just cut that out and send it to him in America.
Yes, please.
Where he's run away, obviously, in order to escape this stream.
Well, yes, he ran away to America in order to not have to be here when I crossed into having 20,000 subscribers.
Of course, and a number he will never reach.
Well, I'm afraid I think he is going to get there in double time, to be honest.
Oh, he's
growing at quite a rate.
Despite all, we are quite affectionate for him. Yes.
And despite all our attempts at sabotaging him on unpopular opinions, I'm afraid he is growing at quite a lick. Yes,
we are. We are attempting to get him to debate V again at some point soon, and we've given him a couple of things to talk about.
So that would be the George Sanders versus Alexander debate, would it?
No.
No, Alexander the meerkat.
Goodness.
I've once or twice when V came on, I have made some kind of ribbing comment in that regard and never got a reaction out of him. Either he's heard it all before, or he just doesn't want to want to respond.
I believe that V is very much up for debating, not Jerry. However, he is academic agent said something along the lines of, "How about if based Liz and I versus you and Mark?" to V, and V said, "I'd much rather just debate you, thanks." And I said something along the lines of, "I can see that V has already recognised that I will be a millstone around his neck." And he said, "And
I think what you are saying is that you would be the penny." For anybody familiar with the Big Bang Theory, once in a while,
I wouldn't describe myself as the penny.
When they have some kind of quiz night or whatever, and they all get together, and of course each one of them are either neuroscientists or into physics or whatever, and then there's Penny who works at the cheesecake factory. So of course nobody wants to have her on their team.
I don't think it's necessarily against me. I'm not as well read.
Yes,
that's all it is. But I am not a penny. Thank you very much. I am not a brainless bimbo. The 1 cent man, says Mike Sanders.
Well, then again, of course, Penny has the advantage that physically she puts all the others into the shadow. So when I'm calling you the penny, I guess I'm also referring to you being the handsome one.
Yes, I am tall, dark, and I do have amazing breasts. Let's move on.
Yes.
The individuals who voluntarily assume risk of physical harm to themselves are a burden upon society, and such behavior should be banned.
Well, so that would be the end of all parachuting?
Yes, all extreme sports shall be gone.
Rugby, cricket. I mean,
we want to see cricket die anyway, but
how would well, I mean, only if the Australians win, or if Scotland ever win again. I mean, there are limits.
Yeah. So this is again a case of how do you define the level of risk of physical harm? Does this mean that
well, it also would include smokers, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Well, yes. Or would electrical pole repairmen be banned from doing this, seeing as they have all those dangerous deaths?
North Sea divers, yes.
Yes.
I mean, I cannot possibly agree with that. I'll say what one is trying to do there is basically kind of say, the health services aren't responsible for those people because it's their own fault.
Yeah. Is
in that case, you just think, well, where do you end there? I mean, where do you draw the line?
Yeah. It's like no one will be allowed to consume more than 3 pints, dependent on weight, because after a certain point, it's risk of harm. Restitution should be paid to victims at the expense of the criminal or negligent wrongdoer.
I mean, this sounds obvious, and therefore I'm kind of trying to think whether there is something that is counterintuitive in this. I guess, as long as it is reasonable, I don't see a problem with that. So
I suppose the issue is if the level of harm is considered to be greater than the funds available to said criminal.
Yes, and also the question of what is the wrongdoing. So the gentleman who claimed to have been offended at Count Dankula's trial, did he deserve any restitution?
He's not a victim. I think
that's just it. I mean, he was offended, wasn't he? And Count Dankula's crime was offensiveness. So he was offensive and someone was offended. So effectively, the offended are the victims of those found guilty of offensiveness.
That's £600, £800, whatever it was he was fined.
Yes, that went through the public purse, but now comes the question, should he therefore also have been
paying all who were offended?
Should he be liable to pay, restitution? Basically, should he have to pay money to the synagogue or something like that?
What was it? Your crime is gross offence. The punishment, you must pay reparations for the offence you have caused to the entirety of the Jewish people.
Even those people who support you and say that they don't want you to be found guilty in the first place. As there were many, but they were not resident in Scotland.
Oh, it's bizarre.
And yes, I actually, I said to Dankula, isn't that in itself a point on which you can appeal? The fact that you were found guilty on a charge that was UK-wide, the crime is based on a law that is a UK law, not a Scottish law.
Right.
And yet you were told you effectively were only allowed Scottish witnesses. So they had to be within the Scottish jurisdiction. So when there were Jews basically telling him that they are quite willing to give him, some
testimony
kind of character witness or whatever in court, Dankula said, well, no, I'm sorry, but it has to be people from Scotland. So to my mind, that in itself is kind of a flaw. That if it's a UK-wide law, then surely anybody in the UK should be permitted to give testimony in court. Because if it would have been UK-wide, then they more than likely would have found quite a few Jews to speak up in favour of Dankula in that court case.
Yes.
But because the Jewish community in Scotland is so small...
Yes, the Skojek, isn't it?
That particular chap is the leader of that particular Jewish community. There wasn't really a way out.
So do you mildly agree?
I would mildly agree, but only on the caveat that that basically sensible laws are applied.
Oh, you can't ask for two. I mean, this.
But you see where I'm going here.
Yeah, I
do. If it
do.
is gross offence caused by a joke, then I don't think anybody owes anybody a restitution.
Very true. Rights such as due process and the presumption of innocence are relics of the past and only interfere with obtaining criminal convictions.
Written by Anita Sarkeesian, I believe. So, yes, I think we can strongly disagree with that.
I believe it's... I can't remember. I was going to make a witticism about a certain MP, but I can't remember her name, who would have also written such a thing. Juries should be able to judge not just the facts of a case, but also the justice of a law.
Well, the funny thing is, juries are already in that position, but it is never pointed out to them. So I strongly agree with that. I believe, wasn't there a case, this goes way back. I mean, this could well be 30, 35 years ago, so I'm assuming no one, will remember this. There was some chap who basically turned up on the front door of a paedophile who had abused his child.
Right.
And blew his head away with a shotgun. And this was in Britain. And they put him on trial for obvious murder. And he was found not guilty by the jury.
Right.
And they kind of realized, yeah, we've got a problem here. That if you present these sort of cases to the jury, juries will very often just say, well, I would have more than likely done the same thing.
Yeah.
So when it comes to juries, it's a kind of strange one, isn't it? As in, how exactly do you apply justice, and how, in a strange way, how do you get them not to do what you want, but what they ought to? Anyway, where are we? Dispute resolution cannot be effectively provided by the market and thus require a government-controlled justice system. Now, it's interesting that they introduce market there.
It's also interesting because we have a very peculiar form of a government-controlled justice system with the separation of the judiciary from the governing body.
Yep.
So it's like
You see,
Yes.
I would like to swap one word with two others.
Go
And then
on.
I bet everybody agrees with me. Then, well, not with me. Then I bet everybody agrees with this particular statement.
Go on.
Dispute resolution cannot be effectively provided by the Sharia courts and thus require a government-controlled justice system.
Yes.
Are there still any people opposed to this?
No. In fact, I find the existence of Jewish and Sharia courts to be quite abhorrent, to be honest.
They are involved in precisely that, dispute resolution. That's what they do. There is a dispute, perhaps between two businessmen in the community, and they sort out the dispute.
I personally agree with this statement in general, because I believe that you are... Otherwise, you end up with a sort of feudal justice system.
Well, yes, and also you have to consider the situation of the giant supermarket chain, like Asda or Tesco, that have a dispute with a farmer that provides them with chicken or milk or something like that.
Yes, and then they pay off.
Decide to just run roughshod over him because they are a giant multinational company, and he is one single individual who doesn't stand a chance.
Not to mention the fact that the small court that this ends up being taken to has absolutely no chance of being objective with the size of the pressure being brought to bear by the court, by the giant conglomerate as well. Because,
but what I mean is, when they say dispute resolution could be effectively provided by the market, well, how would the market resolve that? Well, the stronger one would win. So, in that regard, it does require a kind of third person who is set aside that would be the government-controlled court.
Yes.
To actually settle the dispute. And, that's the only way that you can get anywhere near settling it fairly. So, is this something we strongly... I'm just trying to remember how it was worded.
Dispute resolution cannot be effective.
Yes. Okay, so strongly agree. We are going to take forever. We have to speed this up.
We will need to speed this up. Prisons should be abolished as they currently exist.
I would strongly disagree with that. I think prison reform is highly, highly necessary. But the idea of just abolishing prisons, I don't see that, because there are some seriously dangerous people, and what are we supposed to do with them?
Indeed. The only legitimate use of force is in defense of individual rights, life, liberty, and justly acquired property against aggression.
Well, as such, I would strongly agree, with the caveat that planting Union Jacks on the beaches of other countries or other islands should that should be the acceptable exception.
Should be considered aggression?
Well, no, that's not aggression. That's just bringing civilization. It's
yes.
That's what it is. Go on, please.
All people have the right to self-defense and may agree to be aided by any other individual or group in the event they're being attacked. So if you see someone being attacked and they say help me, then you can come in and smash up the person who's attacking them.
As such, I would say yes to that. I am sure if I would have time to think about that, I would say strongly yes.
Okay.
I'm sure that if I had time, I could think of some exceptions. But right now, we want to speed it up. Plus, I really can't see anything. Individuals do not have the right to keep and bear arms. There I am, I'm afraid, I'm a complete fence sitter.
Fair enough.
I can see, this is just it. I can see the merit in both positions.
I can indeed.
That's why I always end up being accused of, by either side, of holding the opposite position. Because so basically the gun lobby hate me, but then at the same time, those people who want rid of guns also hate me. Because I can see merit in both sides of the argument.
I think hate is a strong word. Perhaps they microaggress you.
Oh, I mean, they don't hate speech me because I don't believe in that principle, but you do realize online, quite a bit of vitriol comes your way, particularly from a certain, a certain territory of renegade colonies across the water.
Mm.
They get very emotional when it comes to this particular subject.
Mm.
Perhaps a little too emotional for people who have guns.
Indeed. Perhaps. People should be prosecuted for exercising their right to self-defense, such as we saw with the gentleman whose home was invaded and he stabbed someone to death with their own screwdriver.
Yes, I strongly disagree with that. I think,
Marvelous.
yes, of course, there will be people who go too far. But I remember on when I was growing up on the continent, there was a famous case where I think it was 6 chaps waylaid one other chap.
Yes.
Who at the time was with his wife.
Yes.
What they didn't know was that this chap was a black belt in karate.
Mm.
Now the thing is, he was then prosecuted for using,
Excessive force?
non-reasonable force, so excessive force. And I just thought to myself, well, hang on a moment. So you have this skill. You are not only protecting yourself, but you're protecting your wife. It's dark. You're being attacked by half a dozen people.
Yes, and you need to make sure that the person who is attacking you doesn't get up again.
Precisely. So basically, if you hit them, you have to hit them so they don't get up again, so that you have to deal with them again, because you've still got 5 others to deal with.
Mm.
So surely at that particular moment, you will use excessive force.
Yes.
And therefore, when it comes to those sort of prosecutions, yes, my sympathy always tends to lie with a person who was the one defending himself. I really think that at times the law goes a bit bonkers.
Mm.
I remember hearing a story, I believe it was in the West Country here in Britain, where a farmer who was he was in a farmhouse that was quite far out. He heard noises coming from downstairs,
Mm.
and he had a phone upstairs next to his bed. So he called the police very quietly, and he said, there's some people in my house. They're downstairs. I can hear them rummaging about. And he was told, well, look, you're far away. We don't have any resources available at the moment. So we advise you just stay put. Chances are they won't come upstairs. They will be looking for valuables downstairs, and just wait until they leave again. Then report to us again tomorrow morning. So he left it 5 minutes, and he was a shrewd man.
Okay.
So 5 minutes later, he called them back and said, oh, it's all right now. I've shot them.
Oh, and they turned up as soon as they could.
Within about a quarter of an hour, he had a helicopter overhead. There was an entire caravan of police cars that arrived.
Yes, I remember.
And the police commissioner himself turned up, and he was given an almighty dressing down as how dare he. Incidentally, the burglars were caught.
Yes.
And
Funny that.
He just looked at them and went, well, I thought you didn't have any resources available.
Yes.
So yeah, that's a little anecdote that I once in a while fondly remember.
One of these days, I'm going to go back through all the streams we've had together, and I'm going to collect all of these anecdotes and put them together in a supercut. And I can call it Story Time with Britisher and have a nice little edited thumbnail, right? Eric Rams in the chat says, completely out of context, but completely relevant at the same time. Reinstate the empire.
Yes, thank you very much. It's about time, isn't it?
Yes. And moving swiftly on, private property owners should be free to set the rules regarding the presence of weapons on their own property.
I would disagree with that.
Strongly or mildly?
I would strongly disagree with that. I don't think it should be, that anybody should be entitled to have their own rocket launcher on their property, or
also entirely reasonable.
Or heavy machine gun trained on the front door of the house across the street, that sort of thing.
The government should restrict, register, and monitor the ownership, manufacture, and transfer of firearms and ammunition.
I mean, there's an interesting one.
I suppose
I would agree with that.
Yes, I suppose it depends, without going too deep into it, on the prevalence of firearms already in your society.
Yes.
And
As I say, I mean that can mean many things. It can also just mean, you know, restricting calibers, restricting whether machine, you know, whether automatic weapons are allowed. I mean, in
yes,
America, sort of automatic weapons aren't allowed. These kind of assault rifles. So you can
yes,
have something that looks like an assault rifle, but it will be a single action rifle.
yes.
So in that regard, even the Americans have instituted those sorts of limitations. So
Mhm. Well,
even
it's
viewed from
interesting.
that position, you would think, well, yes, if even they agree, then
Time for an anecdote of my own, just quickly. The interestingly, when we were looking at getting new weapons for the military, I believe this was in the a little while back, maybe 10, 15 years ago. And we currently operate miniguns. So when the minigun was being advertised, it breaks the Geneva Convention on amount of force that you should use. You know, in the same way that bouncing betties are, you know, banned, because a bouncing betty is designed to kill you rather than merely incapacitate you. And there's been a real lean towards incapacitation in warfare, because if you incapacitate someone, you remove more people from the battlefield, because you've got to get that injured person out of there, and the two guys who are carrying him have to get out of there as well.
that is if on
Right?
that side anybody is bothered about
In,
carrying the
in,
incapacitated chap
in
away. Yes.
Yes, indeed. So, bouncing betties for this reason were banned under the Geneva Convention, and something like the minigun is effectively banned, or it should be banned, because it fires 50 rounds a second, and each round, if people have any knowledge of firearms at all, they should know that bullets expand into small discs when they hit something. And they leave a very large hole because of the kinetic force that gets transferred when they hit something. So you will have a small hole in the front, and then because it's hit something, it molds itself and it comes bursting out the back.
Yes, and if you get hit by something like that at a rate of 50 a second,
well,
it may be like a chainsaw, effectively.
Well, not even that light. It's equivalent to being hit with the dinner plate sized hole. And so, if you can imagine 50 dinner plates hitting someone per second, the survival rate of minigun casualties is not that high.
Well, yes, but consider the lack of suffering.
Yes, I did have a friend who did use one in combat once, and there were 4 men against a wall, and very soon they were smudges. It's not very pretty. I have used one to cut
Was
a car.
the wall still standing after this?
To a degree, because a wall is more capable. But I have seen a minigun cut a car in half in very short order. And we have 2 of them in our Chinooks, one on each side. So they are the most feared air support.
There's one question I need to ask you here, because you've referred to it but not explained what it was. What is a bouncing Betty?
A bouncing Betty is a type of landmine from World War One. And to an extent 2, which has a spring-loaded mechanism. So when you step on it, or on its trigger, it launches itself about 4 foot in the air and then detonates.
Okay, so it's not just a landmine that goes pop. It first decides to leap up.
It doesn't just blow your legs off. It jumps up and then blows you in half.
Okay. Yep.
Right. And you know, dependent on the strength of the spring and where it's angled and whatnot, you can quite very easily will go to. The idea of it is to go to.
Was this a British invention, or was this created by the dastardly Germans and we just copied their model?
I am not. I can't commit to an answer on that one. I'm not massively familiar, but basically,
because, of course, in World War II we had the bouncing bomb. So,
oh yes, from the dam buster.
Given that in the First World War, now you're telling me we had the bouncing Betty, and that was then followed by the bouncing bomb. If World War III ever come about, we would be under some pressure to create something that bounced, wouldn't we?
It's German.
Oh well, you see, it's just some cowardly.
Right.
Cowardly, Kraut weapon. So this just shows we had to effectively come back in creating a bouncing bomb, just basically get our own back after the first World War.
Our bouncing bombs, I believe, were designed to bounce on the water, which is different to these, which you just plant in the ground, which launch, yes, about 3 feet into the air and sprays shrapnel everywhere. Designed to be used in open areas against the unshielded infantry. Blah, blah, blah.
It's just some shabby Teutonic trick, isn't it? That's what you're trying to say.
Well, it's not exactly the rules of engagement friendly, is it?
You do know that were it to have been a British invention, I would have something completely different to say about it.
Oh, of course, yes. You would say, well, it's ending them rightly. Ensuring maximum efficiency or something to that effect. Dominic says, should we have a bouncing nuke? I don't think, given the size, unless you're going to have a nuke landmine, which kind of defeats the object of the nuclear sort of side of things anyway, because a nuclear mine would set off all other nuclear mines in the vicinity.
Would be some kind of, warhead encased in rubber. You'd drop it from a plane onto the territory and it would just bounce around, randomly finding a target.
Well, I believe, what is it in The Dictator? He says, my missile must have a pointy top, not a round top. Why is that? Because if it has a round top, it will simply hit the other side and it will bounce back and hit us. All my other dictator friends will laugh at me.
Anyway, where are we? We are at respect for private property.
Yes, respect for private property rights is fundamental to maintaining a free and prosperous society.
Yes, tell that to the Chinese. Yes, I agree very strongly.
Very strongly.
The agent would be so proud of me.
Contracts to obtain, retain, profit from, manage or dispose of one's private property should be regulated by the government.
Now, that's an interesting one. Obviously, it needs to be enforced. There needs to be law you can come back onto. But do we really need government to have a say-so in contracts between private companies? I mean, that's the way I'm understanding this.
Yes.
So I would say when it is just a private contract, either between companies or private persons, I would strongly disagree with that.
Mm-hmm.
That is, unless there is some sort of, public interest, but that isn't mentioned here. So as such, on a principle, I would say strongly disagree.
Very well. Private property owners have the right to control and enjoy their property and not enjoy it, so long as their choices do not harm nor infringe upon the rights of others.
I strongly agree.
The practices of eminent domain and civil asset forfeiture should be abolished.
Need explanation. Have no idea what we're talking about.
Eminent domain. Let me see. The idea that you cannot have your property reappropriated for public use.
So basically, if one wants to buy a railway, if one wants to build a railway, there is no way of seizing the asset.
Yes.
It's a tricky one.
Well, because of times of national need. Again,
I would somewhat disagree with that.
Marvelous. In order to protect the poor from the rich, limits on profits, production mandates, and controls on prices are necessary.
I'm just trying to think of an exception here. I mean, my instinct there would basically to strongly disagree. But I'm just trying to think of, are there actually any obvious, obvious exceptions?
No, not well. Particularly not in an international world now.
I mean, basically, let's go with strongly disagree. If I can't think, if I can't think of it, this is what I mean. If you would give me half an hour, I might change my mind. But
but unless we want this to become a long-running series, like the 80-part unpopular political compass test.
So for voluntary dealings, parties should be free to trade with who they want and on mutually agreeable terms. I don't see why that should be in any way wrong, so strongly agree.
Marvelous. Private landowners do not have an incentive to maintain natural resources, and as such need to be regulated by the government. So this would be things like, aside from the listing system, I assume it means things like
waterways.
Yes.
So yes, to a certain extent, I agree with that.
To prevent government pollution and misuse of natural resources, public land should be privatized.
To prevent government pollution and misuse of natural resources, I really don't. I don't see the point of that. I would say somewhat disagree. I mean, you know, if we take something like national parks that one could basically say are in government hands,
yes,
I don't see what's gained by privatizing that land.
Protecting the environment requires that resources like land, water, air, and wildlife be held in common, and private ownership should be restricted.
What?
So, protecting the environment requires that that basically the people own land, water, air, and wildlife, and private ownership should be restricted. So, the idea that basically, effectively, the state would control land, water, air, and wildlife. And, you know, if you're a business or you're a corporation, you cannot own the land, for instance, that your building is built upon. You can rent the space, but you can't own the land. And you can't. So, for instance, it would have to be government regulation.
Everything. I mean, that would effectively mean that land ownership of any kind is kind of pretty much
off the table.
No longer possible, or very, very severely restricted, and everything would therefore be, you know, commonly owned. So I strongly disagree with that.
Yes. The profit motive stifles innovations and behavioral changes required to protect the environment, requiring intervention in the market. So, because of profit, you know, people won't look after the environment if you don't.
I'm so, you know, I'm so reluctant the fact that there's only these 5 dots, because I would so like to be there to be 7 dots, because like this I could have a dot between you know, sitting on the fence and somewhat reluctantly agreeing. So let's say I somewhat agree with that.
Very well. Environmental advocates and social pressure are a more effective means of changing public behavior than government action. I would say social pressure is, personally, but this is your test.
I wouldn't. I would say if it's just environmental advocates and social pressure, we would more than likely be still handing out millions of free shopping bags in the country. But it's also because effectively government introduced, you know, regulations basically saying that that can't happen anymore. That now several billion fewer plastic bags are being used.
Also true.
So I would say somewhat disagree with that. I can see what the argument is, and I understand it from a position of social attitudes. But in the end, if you need something changing, and you really need to change it with a certain amount of urgency, then waiting for social attitudes to change may be too late.
Oh, yes, arguable. Subsidies for energy production should be abolished.
I disagree.
Energy pricing, allocation, and production are too important to be left to the market and should be controlled by the government. Well, yeah, this is one of those tricky ones, isn't it? Because of the big 6.
Yes, I somewhat disagree with that. So I would, you know, on principle, I see where they're coming from, but at the same time, we know that we've got a somewhat skewed market.
People who think they are entitled to keep what they earn are being selfish and should be forced to pay their fair share.
This is an interesting one, because On principle, I think, well, of course, people are entitled to keep what they earn, but I am not with Stefan Molyneux that basically thinks all tax is theft.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I would somewhat disagree with this.
Yeah. You're wishing for a point here, aren't you?
Yes, exactly.
That's fine. This will be somewhat inaccurate, but it is
to my mind. In order to explain tax, just quickly, the way I see it, what your gross earnings aren't really entirely yours.
Mm-hmm.
So I understand your net earnings to be what you actually have earned. Now, I know some people will say, oh, that's disgraceful, it's all my money. And you sort of think, well, look at it from the perspective that you know, how many people need to travel to work on the road? Yeah. You know, so basically they need to go by car to their place of work by road.
Yep.
And they all then think that the money they earn and they bring home should all be theirs.
Mm-hmm.
And nobody should have to pay for the road.
Mm-hmm.
And you sort of think, well, I'm sorry, but that road needs to be paid for because that has effectively enabled you to earn this.
Yes, and where you see things like, because Belgium does a system where, certainly apart from the big roads, any road with property on it has to be maintained, that section, by the property owner, and it leads to some very poorly maintained areas, and certainly no path.
The road I see as sort of a simple example, but in a way, I would regard the entire societal structure as that road. So everything that actually maintains the society and the market that enables in the first place these profits to be made,
yes,
effectively needs to be maintained.
That is an argument that you can make, yes.
So yes, that's my view. That is kind of the counter Molyneux argument that basically says, well, it's all just theft.
So I would say that you probably agree with this statement then. Taxation is the price we pay for civilization is a valid statement.
I would somewhat agree, because a lot of taxation is also just nonsense. I mean, you know, when we pay for whatever luxury we want in terms of how many people we want in prison, because we want to be seen to be tough on crime, so we're willing to pay £35,000 per annum per prisoner, so that we can be, you know, we can tell ourselves that we're a society that's tough on crime.
Yes.
And then you look at a lot of the people in prison and you just go, why on earth are they there? So yeah, there is a lot of just utter ludicrous wastage. So not all taxation is the price of civilization, but some of it, I'm afraid, is.
I am completely neutral on this next point. I'm on the fence because it's completely situational. But government budgets should be balanced by curbing expenditure and not by raising tax.
Well, that always just depends on the situation, doesn't it? So I would just stay on the fence too. I don't see how one can.
Yes.
How one can plausibly, you know, really sensibly answer that without completely contradicting oneself.
Yes. People should be free to choose which products and services they wish to purchase and not be forced to pay for something against their will. This would be.
We're talking BBC license fee here.
We're talking
really?
BBC license fee. We're talking national insurance in terms of the NHS. Even though we know that national insurance doesn't really pay for the NHS.
Well, I would somewhat disagree.
Free market banking with competition amongst banks and depository institutions of all types is preferable to a central bank.
Also, basically, a world without any central banks is preferable.
Yes.
I somewhat disagree.
Profits and losses should be socialized. I have no idea what this means.
This somehow sounds leftist, doesn't it?
It sounds very... if you're not making exactly 50% profit or 50% loss.
Well, no, to me it sounds basically that the profits... Well,
caps,
I don't know I don't know how you socialize losses. My view would be that socialized profits would more than likely mean distributing them among the populace, so to speak.
And socialized losses would be either bailout or
Yeah,
again,
it strongly. I'm not quite certain about this, but this sounds very strongly like communism to me. So I disagree. I strongly disagree.
individuals who engage in voluntary exchange should be free to use as money any mutually agreeable commodity or item. You should be able to barter with items, property, etc.
I mean, who's to say what is what one should be allowed to exchange?
Well, it's like you get
I think
part
they're
exchange.
looking. I think they're looking at these what are they, the Bitcoin currencies and whatever they're called. I've forgotten the name.
Cryptocurrency.
Yeah, it's no longer quite that fashionable since they all lost so much value.
Yes,
I can see sooner or later restrictions having to come in, some kind of regulation having to come on cryptocurrencies. And if that happens, you won't really find me crying over it. But as such, what is money? I mean, if somebody exchanges a mule for so and so many thousand walnuts, are the walnuts in a way a currency, or are they just walnuts? Do you understand what I mean? So
yeah.
On principle, I would agree. I would strongly agree. I mean, but I know that in terms of cryptocurrencies, yeah, I think that the worry there is that they could end up destabilizing things, particularly because really, when you look at them, today they're really just speculative tools.
Inflationary monetary policies and legal tender laws should be abolished. Leading on from that, then.
I don't know what legal tender laws are.
The idea of something being legal tender. So you should be able to pay for something. If you agree with it in a transaction, you agree to pay someone in euros, or you agree to pay someone in dollars, or if you agree to pay someone in walnuts, you should be able to do so. And you should be able to pay your taxes.
Well, I mean, if you've agreed, if the deal has been agreed in walnuts, then it's in walnuts. But when something is legal tender, I mean, if basically a shop in Britain suddenly, in England, in the south of England in particular, suddenly decides it won't accept Scottish money.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, it's legal tender.
Yes.
So what do you expect the Scotsman who is, just
down for his holiday?
Scotland, what do you expect him to do? So it is legal tender. So in that regard, I would strongly disagree with that. I think that yes, that there has to be, in a way, just with a country where you have to agree what the language of the country is. You also effectively have to agree what the currency of the country is. So if you have got what is legal tender in your country, and you walk into a shop in which to purchase something, then surely you can then not be told, oh no, sorry, we don't accept that.
Yes,
it is legal tender in your country. So yeah, money should be abolished. I strongly disagree.
Marvelous.
Oh my God, my dot just moved.
It did indeed. Individuals have the right to form corporations, cooperatives, and other types of entities based on a voluntary association.
I strongly agree.
Private ownership of the means of production should be abolished.
I strongly disagree.
You're moving more fashy here. Subsidies. I mean, really, you'd need to be up here for that. But subsidies and bailouts to business, labor, and other special interests should be abolished.
Once again, I'm thinking here. I mean, I agree. I agree on principle when it comes to saving companies that are in trouble and things like that. But on the other hand side, I think all countries are quite keen to look after their shipyards so that because they've got a strategic interest within that and whatever. So I
also think
somewhat agree. So basically, I agree, but I understand that there will be exceptions to that.
Public entities should be able to compete with private enterprise. So you may have partial nationalization of the rail service.
Public entities should be able to compete with private enterprise. Well, on principle, I would say no to that. Again, there would be exceptions I could think of, but let's say I strongly disagree with that. I may change my mind. I mean, people will already now be screaming at their computer screens saying BBC, BBC. So I may have to row that back, if you know what I mean. But what is it here? Employment and compensation agreements between employers and employees are private and should not be encumbered by social engineering.
So minimum wage laws and that sort of thing.
Let me think.
How dare you think on this thinking test?
Well, I will be terribly boring here. I will sit on the fence.
Very well. Look, we're all over two-thirds
I'm not quite as ideological on those kind of things as the academic agent would like me to be. Private employers and employees should be required by law to bargain with each other
through a labor union.
Through a labor union. I strongly disagree with that.
Membership in a labor union should be a requirement for obtaining any employment.
Oh, of course. No, I strongly disagree with that.
What are you, some kind of, anarchist? Compulsory arbitration and obligations to bargain are necessary to ensure that bosses do not exploit their workers. Therefore, again, unions.
Compulsory arbitration and obligations to bargain. Obligations to bargain. I'm not quite sure what we're talking about here.
Me either. If anyone in the chat wants to elucidate us, that's quite possible. I think arbitration means that you need to have a middleman. aka
but basically, if there is some sort of dispute or whatever, there has to be some kind of arbitration between the two sides.
Yes.
So like that, the employers cannot just use their more powerful position, given that they are the ones on whom the others depend for their income.
Yes. I assume it would be something like wrongful dismissal systems and that sort of thing.
So I agree to a point. I've heard some examples, where effectively every time when a company is kind of forced to go into one of these arbitration rounds, it costs them thousands of pounds. So very often, if the claim of the other side is just for 2,000 or 2.5 grand or something like that, it's actually in the company's interest to just give in and give them the money, because if they actually have to get lawyers and all sorts of representation and go through arbitration, it may well cost them up to 15 grand.
Nice to see you, Staff Sergeant Sniper. He says, you had it right. It's about unions. And Dominic says, basically forcing people to go on strike when the union makes that decision as well.
It doesn't sound like that, does it? It doesn't sound as if it is anything regarding forced strikes.
No, I just...
So in my mind, it sounds as if there basically that there would be some obligation to join in with arbitration. Well, look, given that we don't even know exactly what this means, I think I'll just stay on the fence and we can move on.
Provision of education should be socialized and made available free of charge. Just making you...
I somewhat agree with that.
I can just see the gears telling me you're just going, do you know what? This is a topic for an entire stream or an entire video. Why are you forcing me into this? You're a horrible person, Mark.
I somewhat agree with that. I could go into that and academic agent would hate me forever. But let's just move on. Education is best provided by the free market, achieving greater quality, accountability, and efficiency with more diversity of choice. I somewhat disagree with that.
Marvelous. The education of children is the financial responsibility of parents or guardians and not the government.
That depends on what you call education. So
on the fence then.
Well, no, put it like this. When it comes to teaching them maths and things like that, I think there should be a school system. I think there should be a public school system, as in a truly public school system, as opposed to what we call public schools, which are in reality private schools. But when it comes to differences, like, teaching children basic morality and things like that, that to my mind falls to the parents and not to school systems. That's where those are two different types of education. One of which I agree should fall into the hands of the parents, whereas the other one, I think, yes, we more than likely do need a state, school system, because otherwise it just wouldn't work. So given that I agree one way and disagree the other, that kind of forces me into the center. So we might as well just keep me sitting on the fence.
Marvelous. 3/4 now. Health insurance companies exploit the sick and the dying to make a profit and therefore should be regulated.
I would have assumed they would be regulated at the moment anyway. So this would basically be advocating for the status quo.
Yes. Also, but it's again this statement that I don't like the leading nature saying it's exploitation. I mean, it's providing a service and making a profit off that service. But
yes, but what I mean is, it's if you agree with this, I think what you're agreeing with it is the conclusion rather than the statement that they're exploiting the sick. Do you understand what I mean?
Yeah.
So should it be regulated by government? I would somewhat agree.
Somewhat agree.
Yes.
To people in the chat who I'm forgetting that I can just chat to, I try and schedule these streams so that they appear. So the event goes live hours before the stream goes live, and then hopefully people figure out that it's going on.
By the way, may I just say I'm so proud of you for saying schedule.
Yes,
because so many people say schedule, and that is actually an American pronunciation.
Well, there is an H in it. Individuals should be free to determine the level of health insurance that they want, if any.
Well, this is basically just an argument for everybody having private health insurance and nothing else. I would somewhat disagree with that.
Healthcare should be provided by the free market.
Which would effectively mean and nothing else. Which I would somewhat disagree with.
Suicide and euthanasia should be illegal.
I'm somewhere between somewhat agreeing and sitting on the fence.
Yes.
In some cases, I think some cases of euthanasia should be legal. I think the guy who had acid poured over him recently should have been allowed to die. I don't think he should have had to travel to Holland or wherever. But as a basic rule for the general population, I think it should be illegal.
Yes.
So I would love to see some exceptions introduced in law. I would love to see Parliament actually have the guts to debate it and seriously find some solutions to the current problems with people with terminal illnesses, when nothing is gained by forcing them to live on.
Yes.
But at the same time, as a general rule for the population, I would say somewhat agree with it being illegal.
Yeah, so you get the case where in Switzerland, 40% of applicants to Dignitas have a weariness of life.
Yes, I think being weary of life shouldn't really qualify.
Yes.
But I think if you are really, truly, disabled and you know that you're just going to have a miserable death, and it's only going to go downhill from where you are, and it's incurable, then I just don't see why people like that ought to be forced on. And when it comes to Parliament, I think it is just a case of abject cowardice of them not tackling this. And I think a great deal could be learned by just informing us more about what goes on in Parliament, because I think people ought to know how much time they waste talking about utter piffle.
Yes.
This time, in the week that was, I went on how some committee has debated and made a recommendation to Parliament that there should be a quota for women witnesses to parliamentary committees, that one should aim for at least 40% of witnesses to parliamentary committees in future being female. Now, that is the kind of stuff they waste time on.
Yes.
If you look at in the last 20 years, the hours, if not weeks, of parliamentary time that has been taken up talking about pornography.
Yes.
When you just think, I'm sorry, they have got the time to talk about this stuff. They have.
Yes.
They just need to get rid of the nonsense. And to a certain extent, that should also fall to the speaker to just basically say, no, we're not talking about this. Move on. Let's find a real subject.
Mm.
And so I think the great issues of the day, such as euthanasia and whatever, should be tackled by them, because that's the sort of thing we have them there for.
Yes, and not meaningless.
And they should just find the time to do so. I mean, when you hear that they haven't got enough time to talk about Brexit, I mean, that's laughable. It's the biggest decision since the Second World War, and they say they haven't got enough time for it.
Rubbish. Provision of healthcare should be socialised and made available free of charge. And again, that's funny, isn't it? They say free of charge, but don't talk about taxation or whatnot.
Yeah. So I somewhat agree there. I am a fan of the concept of the NHS, although that I'm not particularly happy with the way it's run.
Agreed. Staff Sergeant Sniper Dominic says, sorry, imagine how much longer this would take if Bantu was on the stream. Yes, I am imagining myself, but also thinking that I probably should have sent the test to Britisher beforehand and asked him to fill it out, and then we could have discussed his results on the stream. Yes. Which, if I have ever anyone else on to do a similar thing, I will definitely be doing.
But then you wouldn't have my virginal reactions to this, would you?
I was also, yes, I was keen to do that as well. And I didn't realise you were quite so virginal. Staff Sergeant Sniper says medicine should either be fully socialised or full-on free, because the stupid half and half approach is what is screwing the US healthcare system at the moment. Full-on free market, he means, not full-on free, because this half and half approach is what's screwing the US healthcare system. Potentially. But that's a topic for an entire stream. I mean, or a video, certainly. Not all individuals will take responsibility for planning their retirement. Therefore, an age-appropriate pension should be provided.
I don't think it's always a question of responsibility. I think in many cases, people are just not in the position to do so.
Certainly in a renter's market that we're in at the moment.
So, an age pension should be provided. I would say I somewhat agree.
I love how you're edging leftwards now.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're sort of, as the future slowly dawns on us that robots are going to do more and more and more. I think we may end up in some strange communist utopia eventually. Anyway,
that's Sargon's theory. Anyway, that socialism is not the road to communism, but capitalism is. But the socialists haven't realised this yet. Socialised welfare programs should be phased out and replaced with a private voluntary system based on insurances, charity, and mutual aid.
I somewhat disagree. I really don't think that it would work quite as smoothly as some people think. That all we need is some charities to take care of it,
yes, I've met some people like that.
Even with the situation as we have it now, we've still got lots of homeless people and whatever. And I know some people say, those are all just people with mental health problems. That's not what I've heard. So anyway, where are we? Most people will not, if you go on,
voluntarily help the poor. Therefore, it is incumbent upon the government to provide welfare to combat poverty.
I'm afraid I agree. I would actually strongly agree with that.
Very well.
I'll put it like this. The favorite thing I always fall back on is Roman history. I think Sargon has got the same affliction. So basically, there we had a situation where, because of all the wars, Rome basically captured a huge amount of slaves. I mean, we're talking millions. And what happened is they all ended up in Italy, and they were running what were called latifundia, which were massive farms. I mean, you're pretty much sort of thinking, industrialized farming centers that belonged to extremely rich senators. And because they were entirely run by slaves, there was no overheads, there was no cost.
Yes.
So the actual smallholders upon whom the Rome had depended were being driven out of business.
Yes.
They could not compete, particularly because the smallholders were actually the backbone of the Roman army. Because basically it was deemed that the people who had a landholding could get the vote, but they would in turn also have to serve in the army.
Right.
So they could have to go off for years at times, or the sons had to go off for years fighting in some campaign somewhere in the Middle East.
Somewhat, yes.
So not only were they being taken away from their own farmland, but those members of the family that stayed behind had to compete with the slaves these wars brought back to Italy. It simply didn't work.
Somewhat of an imposition.
The smallholders were driven out of business by the thousands. Well, where did they all end up? They ended up as the urban poor in the city of Rome. They were literally what they called the proletarii. That's where the word proletarian comes from. They were the ones with nothing. They owned the shirt on their back. That was it.
Yes.
So that is why, through the tribunate and whatever in Rome, the proposal was made that there should be a corn dole, that there should be at least a subsidy on grain. So at first it was a subsidy for many years. Later, under the emperors, I believe it became free completely. The people were just handed food.
Right.
But even then, the rich senators still opposed it. The political right that we are told by some entity doesn't exist.
Yes.
They were completely against this. They said, "Oh, this is nonsense. Why should we sustain these paupers?"
Well, would you say it was somewhat ethereal, the right?
The reason they ought to sustain those paupers is because they were the ones who had put them in that place in the first place. Had it not been for the rich senators with their latifundia,
yes,
these people would have still been out on the land farming.
Dominic says, "Where was Carlius Marcus?" when all this is going on.
Pass.
He also says, "I'm going to do a shot every time the Britisher says somewhat."
Yes.
And
good luck with that. Please don't don't blame your liver transplant on me when you're finished.
You are almost as bad as Jordan Peterson saying, roughly speaking.
Well, actually, the Carlius Marcus of the Roman history were Gaius and Tiberius Gracchus.
Of course, you know this.
So basically, they were the ones who insisted on there needing to be land reform and things like that. And I think they actually managed to force through a program for some time, whereby some of the urban poor were given land to farm again, because they realized that if the Roman Empire ran out of smallholders, they in turn would run out of soldiers. And they were proven right in the end, because what happened is that laws were changed because one didn't have enough smallholders anymore, or one realized that one was running out of smallholders. So instead, one allowed the generals to recruit from the urban poor. And whereas previously, the people who were from the land would bring their own equipment, now the rich generals would basically provide everything for these soldiers.
I see.
And the problem was that with that, what was happening was you were no longer having people who had land who were fighting in defense of their own interest, of their own land. You now had completely dispossessed men who at first didn't even own the armor they wore, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And owed everything to the general on whose patronage they effectively depended. And that's why you then ended up with a situation where armies would willingly march on Rome if the general said so.
Yes.
Because previously, commanders would more than likely not have been able to even issue that command because their army would not have obeyed. So yes, the Gracchi proved somewhat to be on the right side. So the the Carlius Marxus of the Roman Empire, I'm afraid turned out to be on the right side of history.
I have no idea what you were responding to now when you began your anecdote, but I enjoyed it nonetheless. Charity and civil society will weaken if the government does not have the power to direct such activity.
Strongly disagree.
Strongly disagree.
I'm quite sure that people like Diane Abbott and whatever are convinced of that, but I don't believe it for a moment.
If Diane Abbott is convinced of it, I'm not likely to be in support of anything that she says, particularly when she believes.
We have got some politicians who are just wrong by default on everything.
Indeed.
You know, I mean,
even a stopped clock is right once a day.
I mean, David Lammy and Diane Abbott and what's he called, McDonnell. I mean, people like that. You just sort of think, I'm sorry, whatever they say, I'll side with the opposite.
In order to preserve global stability, the government needs to embrace foreign political alliances and act as the policeman for the world.
In a way, no, but in a way, yes. And on top of that, it sounds terribly imperial. So I will go with I agree somewhat. And yes, I've said somewhat again. So
please continue to say somewhat, because I want to see how things go.
You want to see how disjointed the spelling becomes of that particular person who said that they would take a shot every time I said.
Oh yes, I want to see. I want to see if Dominic responds to the word somewhat with more and more, like if it's at a point where it becomes somewhat. National service, yay or nay?
National service, nay. Strongly disagree.
Rights are not inalienable and can be suspended during times of war. The conscription.
Conscription, yes, but I'm also thinking of other things. I would say I somewhat, yes, Dominic, I somewhat agree.
You what?
I somewhat agree.
You somewhat what?
Well, I'm thinking of, the Isle of Man. That's where they sent all the Germans.
Right, yeah.
And I remember, I think Churchill actually wrote some kind of letter to his cabinet who were distraught when he was letting them go again. And he said, look, in 1940, when we were really in the pit of darkness, when we were fighting for our survival, then we were perfectly entitled to hold these people.
But not now.
At the first opportunity of it no longer being necessary, we have to let these people go because they have done nothing wrong. They just happen to be citizens from that part of the world. So he let them go, even though the war wasn't over yet. And even though politically, everybody would have agreed with him.
Yes.
But he just said, look, we're no longer fighting for survival. We're actually quite secure by now. If anything, it's us bombing them, not the other way around.
Yes, we're winning.
We have to let them go. We have no entitlement to keep these people in a position that injures their rights for a minute longer than necessary. So I think that is where where the old man showed his greatness.
Yes, that's a very healthy position in my mind.
But it basically meant that he conceded that if push came to shove, and where they were really when Britain's back was against the wall, then they were entitled to suspend those people's rights briefly.
Intelligence agencies would be obstructed from preserving security if they were subjected to oversight and transparency.
Well, I mean, they have to be subjected to oversight because they have to be, they have to be controlled by somebody. But I think that to a certain extent is the case. I mean, there is a sort of oversight committee in Parliament that kind of does this. One of the problems is that
Staff Sergeant Sniper says compulsory service might kill microaggression culture. Just saying, and I have to say to that, well, you would say that you're a Staff Sergeant Sniper.
You see, when it comes to compulsory military service and things like that, we always like to sort of think of some miscreant and sort of think, oh well, yes, that will do him good. That will instill him with some discipline. Isn't that nice? Yes, but how many delicate flowers like Stephen Fry or whatever would have been utterly crushed if they had been sent into compulsory military service?
Mm.
Do you understand where I'm coming from here?
Yeah, of course.
You know, society is a kind of multiplicity of things, and there are different layers. And for some people, the military works brilliantly. For other people, it doesn't work at all because they just don't belong there.
Staff Sergeant Sniper says, I didn't mean, or I didn't say military.
I mean, it would more than likely end up being something paramilitary anyway, wouldn't it?
Well, yes, or you'd have a swollen state because you had to employ so many people, because you couldn't not employ them anymore. But it's an interesting one. Where are we on oversight and transparency in the intelligence community?
I would somewhat disagree with their being obstructed.
Yeah.
You know, you obviously don't want to publish what they're doing in the local newspaper, but at the same time, somebody actually in a position from outside of the information, so of these secret services, must have some oversight of them. Otherwise, they run out of control, which was the case, I believe, somewhere in the 1990s in Turkey, where the Turkish secret services were literally kidnapping people and demanding ransoms.
Mm.
So, you know, secret services can indeed go completely out of control.
Very true. The government should not use secret classifications to keep from the public information that it should have. Now, that's a question.
Well, I mean, that's the famous Sir Humphrey thing, isn't it? Just basically say national security and then just hush it up. So basically, yes, if the public should have some information in order to make an informed decision on something, then using some kind of secrecy to prevent them from actually accessing that is, you know, just by principle wrong. So to my mind, the key word here is should have.
Yes.
So if there is information that the public should have in order to make an informed decision on a referendum or an election, then yes, then they should have it.
Yes.
And then no amount of argument that it should be secret for some sort of national security purpose really washes. So what is it? Am I saying yes or no? What am I saying
you
here?
You would be saying somewhat no.
Should not use secret. No, I think I would be. Should not use. No, I think I'm saying somewhat yes, aren't I? Because it should not.
Yeah. Sorry.
Yes. Okay.
Foreign policy should seek to keep the nation in a position of strength relative to other nations.
That's almost. I mean, that basically means follow the national interest, doesn't it?
Yes.
So, let's say I strongly agree. I mean,
that authoritarian in you there, just jumping you up.
Of course.
I think we've got about 10 left. Foreign policy should emphasize defense against attack from abroad and enhance the likelihood of peace by avoiding foreign entanglements.
I somewhat agree. You know, you can never rule out entanglements because otherwise one wouldn't have come to the defense of France and Poland in some entanglement somewhere in the 1940s.
Yes. Foreign intervention, including military and economic aid, are necessary for preserving the security of the nation.
They can be, so I somewhat agree. But Dominic, still doesn't mean we ought to be quite as trigger-happy as a certain Mr. Blair.
Dominic says, I hate you, I'm not playing this game anymore. He's referring to the somewhat trigger game.
No, to be honest, I think he's wrong there. I don't think he hates me. I think he only somewhat hates me.
Someone is somewhat I can't say with a straight face. Somewhat is somewhat inclined to be somewhat disparaged. Somewhat. All people have the right to resist tyranny and defend themselves and their rights.
Well, I mean, we just had a wonderful exchange. I don't even know with whom that was anymore. On where I'm just trying to think who it was. It might have been Sophane. I'm not sure. And someone was basically saying, "Oh well, people have now got the right because it's gone too far in Britain. So people are entitled to kind of start a revolution and whatever." And he kind of objected to that, saying, "Are you kind of out of your mind?"
Yes.
And I remember I responded to Sophane by saying, "Yes, revolution sounds so much nicer than killing people."
Yes. My favorite quote on revolution actually comes from Terry Pratchett. And one of his novels where there are people who are stampeding through the streets, and with great comic timing, there's an old man sitting outside a pub having a pint, and one of the young men comes and says, "Come, join the revolution." And the old man sits there thoughtfully for a second and says, "If it's all the same to you, I'll finish my pint and I'll join the next one." To which the young man looks quite aghast and says, "But there won't be a next one. We're going to overthrow the bourgeoisie and we're going to take back control of the nation and it's going to be great." And the old man says, "Well, the clue's in the name, isn't it? It's called a revolution for a reason. It goes round and round.
It revolves." Yes. I mean, to this statement, I would say I slightly agree.
Yes.
There's no point saying somewhat anymore, because there's no point in winding Dominic up.
Oh, bless.
So the reason I slightly agree is because, yes, of course, people have the right to resist tyranny, but the problem is that people are so trigger happy in jumping the gun and immediately demanding, "Let's go fight."
Yes, it tends to go from 0 to 100 very quickly. Sergeant Sniper says he's clearly dying. It's 999 over there. Yes. It is, but you're likely to get directed to, "This is not an emergency, and therefore you should call 101. Impediments to free trade should be abolished.
Well, on principle, yes. So let's. I'm just thinking. Yeah, well, it's too late now. I was just thinking whether that should be a slightly yes, but it's too late now.
Yes.
So political freedom and escape from tyranny demand that individuals not be unreasonably constrained in the crossing of borders. Well, what does unreasonably mean?
I know, it's all terribly vague, isn't it?
Because, I mean, if it means we want a country without borders, we want nations without borders, I think we're seeing in the current experiment that doesn't work.
Yes.
But at the same time, do we really want everybody to have a rectal exam if they pass through an airport?
Yes, with the Rector Scanner 3000. Have you not seen those? They're brand new.
So that's a bit. I think this question tilts towards people escaping from tyranny. So basically,
yes, refugees. Yes, refugees and asylum seekers.
I'm just
again. It's the word unreasonably, and we could debate unreasonably.
Well,
but
I'll just sit on the fence on this one.
Very well.
I think the question is just too vague.
There is no shame in sitting on the fence.
One is trying to interpret them rather than actually taking it verbatim. So
Indeed.
In that case, I think we just better pass.
Trade should be regulated by the government.
Well, I mean, internal trade sort of is regulated by the government. It has been for time immemorial.
Well, yes, that's what.
Because there has always been a, even if you go back to ancient times, the ancient Greeks, the ancient Romans, my guess is also the ancient Persians and the Egyptians, and you could go back more than likely all the way to the Sumerians and whatever, that there will have been an authority that checked the weights in the market.
Yes.
So that if someone actually bought a pound of grain, that it was a pound.
Yes.
And that the trader wasn't diddling them by using a false weight.
Indeed.
So in that regard, it's regulated by the government.
Mm-hmm.
And in that regard, it must be regulated by the government, because who else would do it?
Yes, you wouldn't trust a private enterprise.
So I strongly agree.
Economic freedom demands the unrestricted movement of human as well as financial capital across national borders.
I strongly disagree. Because as I that's now looking at a kind of borderless world, isn't it?
It is indeed very globalized. All people are born with the inherent right to life, liberty, and property. Or I am interpreting property in a sense as in the right to own property.
Well, that's the one thing that made me balk, because it was, life, liberty, and you went, okay, yeah, no problem. Then it comes property, and you go, the right to property. So if it is the right to own property, as opposed to basically being given a plot of land,
indeed,
then I think, how can one not agree with that? So strongly agree.
Some rights can impose an obligation upon others to fulfill that right. I would assume this is sort of similar to the preferred pronouns sort of issue.
When it's the preferred pronouns, they can kind of go take a running jump. Just
would that be somewhat of a running jump?
Somewhat of a running jump, yes, Dominic. Somewhat. I'm just trying to work out whether this could actually be applied to anything else.
Hmm.
I mean, what other right would? I mean, as I say, is the obligation upon the government? Are those others, or are we just looking at other individuals?
Hard to tell. We are quite willing to sit on the fence on this one if we're not sure.
Some rights can impose an obligation upon others. I would say I somewhat disagree. The only reason I somewhat disagree is because I'm not quite sure of the question. Otherwise, I would completely disagree.
Government should neither deny nor abridge human rights based upon biological characteristics or personal preference.
What would be an abridgment of human rights?
Something along the lines of, let's say, I don't know, you cannot vote. Well, that's not even a human right. We don't have the right to vote.
To deny a human right means you can't,
yes,
you can't do such and such. But what would be to abridge a human right?
I mean,
well, I mean, let's just say, let's say I strongly agree that they should not be denying anybody human rights on the basis of biological characteristics, whatever abridge means in this particular sense.
We're so close. Members of private organizations can set standards of association, and individuals are free to respond with ostracism or boycotts. The idea of things like male-only golf clubs, or the Boy Scouts, or I won't serve you if you are promoting, let's say Cake Gate, that sort of thing.
Well, when it comes to male-only golf clubs and gentlemen-only clubs and ladies-only gyms, I have absolutely no problem with it. And I think it should be applied free of a double standard. So I strongly agree with that.
The parents or other guardians have the right to raise their children according to their own standards and beliefs.
Well, why would one ever disagree with that? So yes, strongly agree.
Parents should be able to abuse and neglect their children without fear of intervention.
Well, I mean,
define abuse.
Define abuse. This is precisely it, because I believe the Nicholas Sturgeon definition of abuse would be different from mine. So, should they be allowed to, have sex with them? Well, no, I don't think so. On the other hand, should they be allowed to smack them? I do think so.
Yes.
But because this really isn't the question of where you draw the line, but it's really a question on principle of whether you would accept incest or not.
Well, there's that. There's also neglect, as in you prioritize yourself for food and that sort of thing. If you're in low income, neglect and abuse can be really, like, people consider some people consider raising someone to a religious standard to be neglect or abuse, and others, say raising someone to be sexually conservative is a neglect or abuse.
Yes, I know, but that's the interpretive thing. But when we actually look just at the crunch of it, if you basically look at it, if you basically agree with this, then you would effectively say children, parents having incest with their children would be okay. If you basically agree with it. So you have to strongly disagree with this, I think, even though it means that people like Nicola Sturgeon will then claim that you would agree with them, which you don't.
Yes. Interesting. Without the state, there would be chaos and disorder.
Strongly agree.
Ooh, 2 left. It is the right of every individual to resist tyranny and abolish it, replacing it with a system that respects individual rights.
It is the right of every individual to resist tyranny and and abolish it. So we're not talking of the people resisting. No. The problem there is everyone's definition of tyranny is somewhat different, isn't it?
It is, yes.
I'm just. It's easy to just say, "Oh, I agree with this." On the other hand side, if you agree with it, isn't it just some sort of terrorist's charter?
Yeah, basically. I mean, again.
So in one way, I agree that people are entitled to resist tyranny. But on the other hand side, yes, you've effectively got the kind of the terrorism angle.
This is characterized or caveated with the second part of the statement, saying it has to be replaced with a system that respects individual rights. So you couldn't replace it with a Sharia system, for instance.
Yes, but I'm quite sure Anders Breivik would claim that he was only interested in introducing a system that would respect individual rights. I'm somewhat suspicious of this one. I think I'll just sit on the fence with this one, I'm afraid.
Very well. The state should be abolished.
I strongly disagree.
Marvelous. Are you ready?
Go ahead.
You are a liberal. I'm sure you probably recognize this. You support a balance of both economic freedom and restriction, blah, blah, blah.
What was cultural -39?
So the -39 is like, so this is the economic line. This is the cultural line. The cultural line goes libertarian or anarchy all the way up to...
the more minus you become, the more libertarian, the more anarchic you are.
Yes, and towards the top is the more authoritarian. From an economic status, again...
economically, I am fairly centrist. Whereas if you look at the line of anarchy or authoritarianism, I am more tilted toward anarchy.
You are, yes.
I'm not overly surprised by that.
Just for context, here is my score.
Okay, so we're in fairly similar waters, really, aren't we?
Which is interesting. So,
except that you're some despotic left-winger.
Despotic. Yes.
Sorry, I misspoke. What I meant to say, Dominic, is that you are somewhat left-wing.
Yes, somewhat left-wing. The interesting thing with me is I'm sure, because I will send this to Academic Agent, this whole stream. In fact, he quite regularly likes to go through it. I'm sure he will enjoy that. I don't know, on the plane or something.
No doubt he will tell us at length what was wrong about every single statement we made, and
not to mention the fact that our scores. So I would really love, and I hope that you will tweet it at him as well, or his associate, so that his associate can
yes, the non-academic Mr. Sly Sneak. Yes,
so you can basically get him to take the test, and then he can compare as well, because it's very curious. But you can say now
it would be hilarious if he would somehow turn out to be more left-wing than the two of us, wouldn't it?
That would be hilarious.
I'm afraid that will just have to have to sort of remain a fantasy, because we know full well that in some of the questions he would just fall off the edge of the right wing of the economic anarchists. Everything would have to be a market solution.
Yes. There we are. I've saved that one now, so we
now
can...
please tell me, what have you learned now that you have seen my result?
I don't know if we've learned anything. I certainly realised that we've picked up a few different bits and pieces. But I was interested.
First off, can I just ask, did you get the same questions, or are they similar questions every time?
They are the same questions every time. As far as I'm aware, someone can correct me on that.
So did you have the same problem with some questions where it was more a matter of interpreting the question rather than actually providing the answer, if you know what I mean? Where that was the main problem, really.
I also took this test with someone else at the same time, and after we had both taken it separately, and we decided we'd go through and see, because we came out very close to one another, and we decided we would check to see basically where we had split, and it mainly came down to an interpretation of the question, and basically to the idea that one should, if one moderately disagreed with something, they potentially partially agreed with it as well. So it was like dependent on whether or not you partially agreed more, or if you partially disagreed more, it would shift you over to a little bit. And so there's a little bit of variance, obviously, there, which is to be expected.
So did I end up somewhere where you expected me to be?
I think you did, yes. I call it the liberalist shit test, as it were. Basically, I was curious because sometimes Academic Agent in particular tends to paint you as the lefty. And
so now I can throw this back in his face and say, no, I am not, and I have the chart to prove it.
But partially, but I would be very interested to see where he comes out, particularly on how close to pure and utter anarchist he is. We're about a third to half of the way down. Sort of, wherever it was you got.
I mean, he obviously advocates. I mean, given that you are going to tell him about this stream and invite him to watch it, I think this is the moment to tell everybody that he advocates, cooking the poor and eating them.
Oh yes, he advocates
a solution to the world hunger problem. Yes.
Yes, he recalls that some people in Soviet Russia were told not to eat their children, and he says that imposition by the government was a negative
breach of the rules of the free market. Yes.
Indeed, and you should have done it. Now we should appeal to AA's love of stats, and you can't say we weren't thorough either, according to Mike Sanders. Indeed.
Well, so we've survived this test. I can say, ladies and gentlemen, that I was looking forward to this with a certain sense of foreboding, because I had no idea what was about to be sprung on me. All I was told is that there was something he would like to do on this stream, and the less I knew about it beforehand, the better.
Dominic says it's the academic autist.
No, it's the academic somewhat autistic, Dominic.
Sunny says it would be a waste if you cooked your children but didn't eat them. It's brilliant. Oh dear. I think that this is probably an appropriate length for a stream. And to do it.
How long have we actually been online doing this?
Well, we started at about 10 to 9.
If I manage to put together this stream, of which I've told you, and which I've told you that you would be most welcome to be online if I manage to put together this stream, And trust me, I am useless at putting together streams, as I've recently managed to confirm to myself.
I will talk you through it after we finish.
Then I would hope to make it some kind of short, sharp shock, as in keep it somewhere around an hour or something like that.
Indeed. I do quite like. I mean, this was obviously a longer one just because of the sheer amount of content
it's so difficult
covered.
to shut me up when one actually confronts me with a conundrum like this. Because I want to explain away every single possible caveat and whatever other, rather than just give you an answer.
Yes, but that's why. But that's why chat loves you as well as myself. And also, for instance, that our stream about tea was very well received.
Well, yes,
I do quite like.
I must say you did surprise me a great deal there, because as you know, in the direct messaging, I said to you, "Are you sure that we can make an entire stream about tea?" And you said, "Oh no, you thought we could fill quite a bit of time with that," and you proved very much to be in the right.
I do like a good ramble with you, particularly when I've got a cup of brew to get going. So that's what I mainly want these to be about, not necessarily grilling you interrogation style over your opinions on things. I want it to be distinct and different to, something akin to an unpopular opinions. I just want it to be a nice chat.
Yes, all we're actually missing is for it to be a lot cooler, and the two of us on either side to be in a fireside leather chair.
Oh yes, with a glass of not brandy but apple juice.
With the oak cupboard behind us, with the books in it, with the leather-bound books in it.
One day when we're properly famous, British,
smoking our pipes.
Yes, one day when we're properly famous, we shall be able to afford a set together. And
each one will have half a set at the other end.
Yes,
and we'll be able to puff on our pipes, and we'll, no doubt by that time we'll be elderly and decrepit. I mean, you'll be elderly, I'll be decrepit, because by that time, given the age difference that I assume between the two of us, I will more than likely, be at one moment taking a draw from my pipe and the next from my oxygen bottle, just to keep me upright.
Smith says those children should be able to cook themselves, the lazy scum.
Well, yes, now that you come to mention it, indeed.
Yes. If only they had been smacked as children, they would be able to. They should have known.
Well, yes, but that was a kind of classic conundrum. That was kind of almost the quintessential question in that regard, whereby when it came to that question about abuse and neglect,
where does discipline end and abuse begin?
Precisely, but you kind of had to question what the interpretation of the person was who was asking the question. So basically, if it's Nicola Sturgeon that is asking you that question, then you know what she means by that, and you will disagree with her.
Yes.
And yet, if it's somebody who is perhaps somewhat more right-wing, then you get the sense that, well, in that case, abuse and neglect will actually be, true abuse and neglect. And then you kind of see it in a different light. So given that you don't quite know where the person asking the question is coming from, you don't quite know how to answer the question, because depending on which perspective lies behind the question, that changes the answer you would give. So yeah, that question was almost kind of sort of the quintessential example for the conundrum that one faced throughout the entire quiz. That one was always asking oneself, what exactly does the person, what's the agenda of the person asking the question? Indeed.
On that note, I think we shall end for tonight. But thank you.
Decision. While Dominic is still somewhat alive.
Yes, I thank you very much for watching. I do try my best to try and list all the comments from the from the chat and so on and so forth, particularly seeing as I do not have access to Super Chat.
Can I just ask you, have you ever been on a live stream with Sargon? On his channel?
Once.
Once. Have you ever tried to read anything of the chat?
No, never.
You can't.
No, you can't. It moves too quickly.
It's like one of those one-armed bandits when you pull the lever and the wheel starts spinning.
Yes.
That's the speed at which the chat comments go by.
And even
make out a single thing.
And even the super chats for him are almost blister buy. I mean, you have to donate a significant amount to see it. But no, so on that view, obviously my channel isn't monetized, etc. If you wish to donate and you feel that it's so inclined, you can find a link to donate on my about page. But there is no obligation, none at all. But thank you very much for tuning in. I hope the next Fake Accents Unite will be back to more relaxed topics and a little less, shall we say, interrogation style brute forcing through questions.
Yes,
and
we'll be debating the merits of current or non-current scones.
Indeed, scones. And there we go. We've had one on tea. Now we'll have it on scones and the appropriate way to jam and cream your clean tea.
Cream, yes,
indeed. Which way it should go, and more terribly British chats. But thank you all very much for watching. I very much appreciate you tuning in. Good night.
See you about.